Всем привет.
I think we should probably kick off our conference. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming and thank you for following our broadcast. My name is Maria Kluchichina. I am the Inclusion Programs Department Head, and this is the sixth conference called Experiencing the Museum. This time around, it is called Web and Digital Technologies as Tools for Museum Accessibility. I'd like to pass on the floor to head of the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, Anton Belov. I'm going to give him the floor for some opening remarks. I don't know what to say. This is the sixth time we have held this conference. It's important that we are still organizing this important event. Last year was a most challenging one, I would say, in light of all the difficulties that we all experienced, and this was also relevant for inclusion programs. And I guess the issues that we will be discussing are of utmost importance. We will be discussing web and digital technologies, which is an issue that museums focused on in the past. I'm not going to touch upon inclusion at all. Back in the past, we discussed the experience offered to customers and so on and so forth. And in the past, most of the museums would say that it was primarily about communications within. But actually, communications start long before people access your website, when they use social media, when they use YouTube channels to talk to each other, when they try to Google some information on an artist after visiting an exhibition. And oftentimes we missed this aspect. Primarily marketing departments, PR departments, or web technologies departments focused on that. For the first time, we have faced this problem when the lockdown was imposed. Fortunately, the lockdown has now been lifted. Well, maybe Russia is a special place because the entire world is still under the lockdown. And it turns out that physically inclusion turned out to be a much easier task physically than the previously familiar channels for museums. So this is exactly what we're going to be discussing during the conference, and we have a special day for international speakers from Austria, the US, Canada, and there will be also representatives of the NPOs, non-profit organizations who specialize that, and we will run this conference in a hybrid format. Well, I guess you're familiar what Garage is all about. If you are not, you can get much information at our sub-web page. We have renamed it, if I'm not mistaken. What's the correct title? Right, the name is Inclusion Practices. We have renamed it 3 times, and the most recent name is the Inclusion Practices. This is the platform that lists all the best practices. They've been translated into Russian for the Russian community to be able to develop their own approaches and embrace them in their daily work. We are quite open-minded to receiving any new materials. If you are interested in that, please forward your info to us. We do have an app. And the very first program that we rolled out was the sign language program for kids. We will soon launch yet another app that you will get more info on in the near future. We will probably make an announcement here. It is called I'm Going to the Museum. That's going to be the name of the app. So we pursue lots of work streams, and just like everyone else, we would like to pursue all of these lines of work. We do have the relevant human resources. We have acquired certain experience, but of course, these best practices are being developed everywhere in the world. Based on my personal experience, all I can say is that inclusion is always primarily about communications amongst people working for various institutions and the visitors, your guests, whatever you might want to call them, those who visit your space. And our main goal is to ensure their comfortable presence in your space. This is the idea that we want to promote in the online domain, and this is the most important part. And now I'm going to pass on the floor to our real experts, real pundits, and the speakers who will deliver their presentations. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anton. To follow up on that, I'd like to add a few words to that. The year of 2020 demonstrated that inclusion practices in the physical domain were not sufficient, and it was of utmost importance to offer inclusion both in the virtual domain as well, because it is as important as the physical one. And to this effect, you need a standalone special team. It is a challenging task. Anton was right in pointing out that it's important for us to understand that inclusion is the right way to communicate to your visitors. And the communications should be tailor-made and personalized for each and every visitor, and should take into account their age, sex, whatever features they might have or not have, abilities and disabilities. As for the web and digital technologies, when prepared for this conference and when we talked to our foreign counterparts, we actually drew a conclusion that many experts that focus on inclusion believe that technologies are just mediators that link institutions that might be quite hierarchical with visitors. And that's exactly what we would like to pursue looking forward. We don't want to develop products for the sake of developing products, but rather our main objective is to set up the right and proper communications with our visitors. We want them to be comfortable both in the physical and in the virtual domains of our museum. Now, let me briefly go over some household issues. Well, I'm going to brief you on what you can expect during the next 3 days. Well, this is the 6th time we've held the Experiencing the Museum conference. For the first time, we've held it in a hybrid format. Day 1 and Day 2, namely the 1st and the 2nd of April, will be held both in this auditorium, and the conference will be broadcast on YouTube. You can register at our website to be able to attend this conference here in the auditorium, and you're more than welcome to do that. You can also follow our webcast on YouTube. By the way, the video recordings will be available on YouTube for a very long time, and you'll be able to use them for your research. The 3rd day will be done online with the YouTube-based broadcast, so you're welcome to follow it on YouTube. As far as the agenda itself, the conference is broken up into 4 sections. Section 1 is going to be held today, during the rest of the day. The name is Transhumanism versus Diversity. And indeed, this is a very ambiguous title. What we mean by transhumanism is actually a set of ideas that envision to enhance a human being with the help of high-tech technologies. And enhancement might be somewhat problematic because no one is still clear on the enhancement criteria. Therefore, it would be of utmost interest to discuss this problem. What we mean by biodiversity is basically a set of ideas that focus not on an enhanced person, but rather on an individual with his or her own traits, features, and they are perceived to be values that have to be reckoned with. And today we'll try to discuss the limitations of using the technologies, the high-tech capacity, especially assuming that we all agree that diversity and inclusion are a must. The 2nd day will be devoted to digital accessibility in various cultural institutions. We're gonna hear out various domestic and international case studies. You'll be told how to develop apps that will make the cultural objects more accessible. You will also learn how to adapt and revise your websites. The first half of the day will be devoted to digital products, while the second half of the day will be devoted to the web resources and the way we can adapt our websites and web pages run by the cultural institutions. You will also learn much information on the accessibility standards, on the way to use various widgets to make your website more accessible, or how to use inclusive design philosophy to make your website or web page accessible. Day 3 will be devoted to what we believe, the discussion of the best international cases, because there are some success stories of various museums and institutions using the most cutting-edge tools to communicate to their visitors. And actually, you might want to learn from the best and use these tools in your daily work. We hope that it will be useful for you in your follow-up projects. Well, to wrap up the opening remarks and the welcoming address, I just wanted to express my gratitude to the Science, Art and Sports Foundation for their help. And now I'd like to pass on the floor to our first speaker of the day, Elena Brызgalina, PhD, head of the Educational Philosophy Department, the School of Philosophy, Moscow State University. Thank you for letting me know that. It's a real honor to kickstart the official agenda of the conference, and the lecture that I would like to deliver is basically an invitation to discuss certain issues. It seemed important to me to first define what contemporary technologies allow us to discuss the traditional philosophical issues in a new way. Let's start with defining biotechnologies per se, because it so historically happened that this definition was used to identify all types of technologies when people use something, some live species. For instance, bakery would be a good example, or leather production, brewery. All of these industries were linked with biotechnologies. In the 1970s, the definition of biotechnology became a more narrow definition. We started to focus on the genetic modifications to enhance human capabilities. Today, we interpret this term in a broader way, and oftentimes what we mean by biotechnologies are basically interventions into the very nature of a human being. And ultimately, what we're talking about is that looking forward, we'll be able to totally modify the nature of a human being. This slide lists the most relevant and key issues. Is the humankind ready for such transformations? Will we be able to call a human a person with an artificial body that acts in a very natural way, or will we be able to call humans those who were born thanks to the ART or IVF technologies, or by modifying the genome? What issues we will be facing in the future, and what issues we are facing right now? These are the issues that are relevant for each and every one of us. We cannot say that someone will be able to avoid facing one of these challenges. It's worthwhile mentioning that humans have always dreamt of becoming better, and it's not relevant how we define a human being, a God-created human being or a nature-defined human being. The idea that a human can, through his or her own effort, through the power of will, overcome the various imperfections and weaknesses is the very key idea. For a very long time, we meant a soft way in terms of enhancements. What we meant was changing the environment through nurturing and changing behavioral models, or by impacting the non-biological aspects of a human body. And in the 20th and the 21st centuries, the biotech became a challenge for the very nature of a human being. The new idea came up, which boiled down to the fact that we should convert the knowledge into high-tech technologies. You probably remember the long-lasting motto, which went as "knowledge is power." Just try to analyze your own self. If you know something but you don't know how to apply this knowledge, you can hardly call this knowledge valuable. Oftentimes I meet with undergrads who actually insist that I should explain to them the need to know one or other thing. In other words, knowledge without practical application in a contemporary society actually lacks any value. It's not enough to know the structure of the world. Sometimes we believe that we know it, but we don't. Sometimes our impact has negative, our actions have negative consequences. Right now, the humankind uses the technologies to enhance human beings. We want to achieve everything fast and effectively, and science and technology facilitate that. Given the pragmatic approach, which means that not only do we want to have an outcome, we want an outcome that would increase our lifespan, make us happy, make us healthier, or improve our well-being. That means that a human being becomes an object of the impact of a phenomenon that we call science and technology. Science and technology is basically a combination of knowledge, technology, and business. And by business, I mean the commercial application of knowledge and technology. While in the past, the very process of getting knowledge could be separated from the process of acquiring knowledge. In other words, these two processes were two different processes. You could acquire knowledge and then decide whether you wanted to apply it, to convert it into technology. The biotech combines the two, and they go part and parcel. I mean, knowledge acquisition and knowledge application. Let's take the genetically modified organisms. When you try to forecast their properties at a molecular level, you simulate the entire organism. But you can hardly predict the traits of the whole, and only when an object emerges, it becomes a subject for study. This is a link that is established by the science and technology. If we apply it to human beings, we realize that it's the human lives that are being transformed, and the main goal is to maximize the value added. We're not talking about changes per se. We're talking about changes for the sake of transcending the limits set by nature. And this phrasing means that we're talking about the so-called hard modification. The underlying idea is that the human body is something that can help us derive pleasure. This is something that we can repair in different ways. And that life does not equal embodiment. Consciousness could be uploaded into non-biological media. Therefore, one of the ideas is to hack, with the help of science and technology, the predefined limits of our nature. Hacking is a buzzword. Hacking is not a crime if we're talking about some technological modifications. However, this is an attempt to transcend the limits set. Let's take a look at the various work streams.
But first of all, before we do that, we have to remember that traditionally, back at the time when genetics was quite underdeveloped, people already had an answer to the question, what matters, nature or nurture? Of course, in the Bible, you know the famous quote that a good tree cannot bear evil fruit. And it is by the fruit that we can know the nature of the tree. So traditionally, we have a lot of idioms that says the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. So traditionally, the connection between political views of a human being, let's say, who is this person? Is he conservative? Is he liberal? That is something that determines the connection between the genes and the environments. Of course, people believe that it is not just nurture, but also nature. You probably remember the notion of blue blood. Therefore, the liberals, or people who associate their political platforms with liberal ideas or neoliberalism, they believe that all people have equal rights naturally, and it is actually the nurture, it is the environment, the social and economic conditions that determine a development of a certain feature. So of course, These are polar views which the science is currently trying to marry. We're saying that right now our nature determines certain features, but these features can further be developed only by nurture. So today we have to say we don't have a single feature about which we can say that it can only come through nature or it can only be nurtured. We all born with half of our genes coming from our mother and half of our genes coming from our father, plus all of the genetic mutations. Well, this is something that makes us absolutely unique. The possibility that you can meet your exact genetic copy, the possibility that somewhere out there in the universe there exists a genetic copy of you is just 1 to 64 trillion chances, unless, of course, you have a monozygotic twin. We're all unique. We live unique lives. We experience unique influences in our families, in our schools. When we talk to our colleagues or friends, we're all different because our very biology is different. And of course, we're all different because we all grow up in different milieus. Therefore, what is going to happen if biotechnologies transform the very basis, the very foundation of our corporality? So the first thing that I want to talk to you about are the boundaries of human existence related to the origin of life. Of course, this century and the last century are characterized by medicalization of birth. People are born in specialized medical organizations. Future mothers are monitored by medical personnel, and it is now the norm. New assisted reproductive technologies help people with different fertility problems to have children. The science itself knows quite a lot about the origin of life or how life emerges. Starting from the very moment of conception, each week of gestation is thoroughly described, taking into account all of the changes that are happening. So, when can we talk about the emergence of life? Does life emerge on day one? Does life emerge with the first heartbeat? Is life when we take our first independent breath? Does life start with a positive pregnancy test? Does it start with embryo implantation in the uterus? Well, the science itself cannot give us a clear evaluation of all of these facts. National legislations look at scientific criteria and they choose one specific criterion, such as the start of life. Some countries say that a life should be preserved before the moment of birth. Of course, when we talk about assistive reproductive technologies, we're talking about surrogacy, we're talking about IVF and other technologies, and these technologies are becoming more popular, not just due to the fact that a lot of couples find out about their infertility, but also because these technologies are now used by people who do not have any medical problems, by people who want to concentrate on their career development. Starting from the very moment of in vitro fertilization and before implantation, well, we usually wait for 14 days. So these 14 days give us a chance to study the embryo outside of the mother's body. They give us a chance to test the embryo. Therefore, we have a possibility to design babies, to give them specific features that we concentrated on when we were doing embryonic research. So, for instance, we can try and get rid of certain diseases, or we can try and edit the baby's genome to get rid of certain features or gain certain features. So let me give you certain examples. So what do people encounter when they meet new technologies. So this is a story that happened in West Germany. A 24-year-old girl, Sarah, wanted to know the name of her sperm donor. Sarah's mother contacted the clinic. She used donor sperm and she signed the contract saying that she will never look for Sarah's biological father. But Sarah believed that her mother's obligations are not binding for her. She just wanted to look into her father's eyes. She didn't want to ask him for any financial help, but she believed that her identity will suffer unless this information is disclosed. So the court ruled in her favor. Here you see a quote from the doctor, and the doctor is saying that all technologies that use donor biologic materials can actually suffer after this ruling of the court, and it is quite unlikely that the sperm donors want their names revealed several decades after the implantation, because that, of course, will bring us an avalanche of problems, financial, legal, and ethical problems. Therefore, the usage of donor sperm has already resulted in many tragic and conflicting situations. Here on this slide, I'm showing you an example from Denmark. And by the way, when it comes to Scandinavian countries, biobanks, Scandinavian biobanks are in high demand. So this case happened in Denmark. It became known that babies who were born from the same sperm donor, you see that the sperm donor remains anonymous. So the sperm donor number 7042. So all of the babies born from this donor were born with very serious medical problems, namely neurofibromatosis. So when the doctors started looking for the origin of the problem, it turned out that all of these children had the same biological father. Therefore, it turned out that the sperm has been used many times. This donor fathered 43 children. Of course, it goes without saying that the donor is attested for potential genetic disease that can be inherited by their children. People look for donors who have healthy children themselves, but of course medicine is not omnipotent. Medicine cannot give answers to all of the questions. And you can see the quote from the chairman of the sperm bank on the screen. Of course, there can always be errors and mistakes. There is a human factor. Biological material can be substituted with another material. There are also people who want to have different parental relationships between them and their biological children. Here you see a quote from a lawyer. That was a speech given by a lawyer after a court hearing. See, on the screen you see a picture of two women who are married, and there is also a picture of a man. This man was selected by these two women as a sperm donors. This man was gay, therefore they believed that he will not want to be a parent, but he felt the urge to become a father, and so they had to turn to court. So the court ruled that this little baby girl had three parents. Therefore, all three parents were given certain conditions on which they can interact with the girl, but the court never deliberated how the girl will feel when she finds out that she has three parents. So modern day technologies, state-of-the-art technologies, allow us not just to help two people to conceive and give birth to a child, but the technologies help us in situations when we can use biologic material of more than two people to have a healthy child. On this slide, you have a very tragic story. This is a woman with a mitochondrial DNA deficiency. All of her children died, including her son, who you see in the picture. So she contacted the British authorities with a request. She wanted her egg to be taken, the nucleus to be taken out of the egg. She also wanted an egg to be taken from a donor and implant the nucleus of her egg cell into the donor egg cell. And further, for this egg cell to be inseminated by the donor sperm. So today we already have babies who have 3 biological parents. And if we were to use our imagination, it is not impossible for people to have 46 parents, because we do have 46 chromosomes and the egg cells. Therefore, our conceptions of parenthood are changing. Our ideas of what it is like to be a parent are changing. We are reviewing our ideas about whether it is okay or not to interfere into the process of birth in order to enhance babies. You probably all know this story about the Chinese professor who wanted to edit the embryonic genome. And if you want to read a little bit more about this story, you can use the link that you see at the bottom of my slide. This story truly resonated throughout the world, and it's happened not just because of technological problems. No, it resonated legally and ethically. Therefore, doctors believe that it is currently really difficult to designate the diseases that could be cured just through genome editing and not by any other means that do not really have a great opportunity for all of the changes to be inheritable throughout the generations. The last 2 years have brought us new reports that an artificial uterus is being tested. The uterus is made from bioengineered tissue, and this artificial uterus, can fully replace a mother, can fully replace a woman. Therefore, this artificial uterus might be used to gestate an embryo. So here, the restrictions are not just limited by intrauterine growth, but the research is already trying to create an artificial embryo. You see on this slide that the UK researchers have made headway in creating artificial embryos. All of these technologies are developing a lot faster than we have a capability to pause and think about it. So today we use different regulation strategies. This is the conditional approval strategy. Therefore, a new technology or a new product goes through initial risk evaluation. And of course, we're not talking about distant risks, but we're talking about the risks that already exist in the short-term perspective. Therefore, if the risk is low or medium, such technology or product is approved for medicinal use. Of course, the constant monitoring should be provided, but if a risk is high, then this technology or product is removed from the market. So this is another example that is closely related to pragmatism. If we do know, if we are aware, then we can change it. Of course, throughout history, we have many examples when people were wary about new technology, electricity, automobiles, but we always understood that risks mean responsibility. Therefore, can we really equate a steam turbine and electric power station, a car, with a technology that truly influences the corporality of human beings, or a technology that can create a human being as a product of biotechnological influence? This question remains open. So the second frontier of the human existence that is going through transformation is related to death and dying. I already talked about the medicalization of birth in the 20th and the 21st century. The same period witnessed medicalization of death. Death became something that can only be pronounced with special knowledge. With developments of intensive care can delay death if people are dying in hospitals other than anywhere else, and therefore medicine governs this process. So death was not just something that was determined by biological processes, but death is now an event that depends on human decisions, on human choice, and on technological capabilities. The development of transplantology, that I will also talk about today, spearheaded the change of traditional dying criteria. Death used to be diagnosed as cessation of circulation, cessation of heart activity, and cessation of breath. But starting from 1920s, a lot of the countries started adopting a new criterion, the brain death criterion. In this country, we had a law that was passed in 1992. That was the law on transplantation of human organs and tissues. Because of intensive care, this demarcation between life and death became very unclear. So now we can keep people on life support for decades. Therefore, all of the scientific criteria had to be tested, not just for their objectivity, but also they had to be matched to cultural norms. They had to be matched to people's expectations. Therefore, the life of an ordinary person was buried under an avalanche of notions without clear definitions. These definitions were very unclear medical definitions that talk about borderline conditions between life and death. And of course, this is related to how people imagine this demarcation line between life and death. Let me show you two cases.
The worldwide famous bioethic drew universal attention to these two cases. Terry Shive was shown on the left-hand side. Well, some people say that she fasted too long and that affected her brain. Back in the 1990s, she went into what the medicine back then called the vegetative state. For the next 4 years, most of the physicians monitoring her believed that she went into an irreversible process. And her husband, who was her official guardian, stated that when she had been healthy, she had stated several times that she would not want to live in a vegetative state. And he actually asked the physicians to take the probe out and switch her off, disconnect her from the life-supporting machines. There was a long-lasting hearing in a court of law, and some physicians stated that her brain was dead, and thus she was dead. While the lawyers of her family stated that the brain still functioned at a minimal rate. While a fifth physician actually stated that it was impossible to identify the precise state of this female, and the court decided to disconnect her from the life-supporting machines, and she died of dehydration 2 weeks later. Which, well, she might not want to live like that, but did she wish to die like that? On the right-hand side, you will see yet another example. This guy was in a car crash, and for 19 years he was in a state that was considered to be totally hopeless by physicians. But none of the family members actually thought about disconnecting him from the life support machines, and 19 years later he came around. Of course, his body was affected, his muscle mass was affected. No physical exercise naturally resulted in the fact that he could not stand upright unsupported. There were some psychological changes as well. For instance, he started speaking truth only, but he was still alive, and he came around to full consciousness. And now let me share with you another case study. These are parents of a girl named Jahi Makmat. Unfortunately, during a surgery, her brain died by it, but her parents would not agree with the diagnosis of the physicians. They actually stole her daughter with the help of a foundation set up by Terry Shaivu, the lady in the previous slide, and they took her to a different state that used not the brain death criteria, but rather the heartbeat criteria to identify, to decide whether a person was dead or not. And she still had some heartbeat. And 5 years later, she died because of the multi-organ failure, and they had two death certificates with two different dates and two different causes. This is something unimaginable in the past. The attitude towards death has changed as well. We are now discussing issues like this is an exhibition that traveled all across the world for decades, and then it finally arrived in Moscow. The heated debate was about whether this exhibition was about art or about sharing knowledge. Social culture that promotes the idea of eternal soul, the eternity of soul, and that we should live on planet Earth in such a way as to be able to make it into heaven. And the totally opposite idea is hedonism. Seize the day, know your body, know how to manage your body. This is a separate subject for discussion. But what I'm saying is that we need to understand the context that the biotechnologies should be considered. So birth, death, but what's in between the two events? It turns out that the mental and the physical integrity of a human being could be intervened by contemporary science and technology in many ways. Please take a look at the slide. There is no difference between an individual and a person. This is David Rockefeller, who lived quite a long life. But there is no precise data on how many heart transplants he had. It's well known that he was a recipient of transplanted kidneys, and that's the way he extended his lifespan. Transplantology is a way to save the lives when all other means fail. And you can enhance donors' organs by preserving them as long as possible. Biosimilars could be produced and developed, but wouldn't you say that a body of a human being would be considered to be a warehouse of spare parts for another human being? And I'm not even talking about some extreme scenarios envisioned by some transplantology experts. What I'm saying is that the attitude towards the human body becomes both illegal and an ethical problem. First and foremost, organs could be taken out of a live human being if we're talking about organs that come in pairs, for instance, kidneys. However, commercial relations are prohibited in many countries across the world. However, donorship as an act of altruism could be embraced by blood relatives. Let's take a look at this particular slide. This is a couple, a husband and a wife. Legally, they are not biological relatives, but they are not blood relatives, but they still can donate their organs to each other. And it's quite clear why such legal regulations are being introduced. The main idea is to limit non-bona fide relations between people. However, at the same time, there are countries that officially allow selling your organs. For instance, non-related kidney donorship is allowed in Iran. As for the organs of the deceased, this slide shows the number of organs that could be donated by a person who opts into the donorship program after his death. Let's try to calculate the number of lives that could be saved by a single person. Across the world, there are two legal ways to regulate donorship after death. The first one is called opt in, which is described on the left-hand side, which means that when you're still alive, you sign a paper saying that you agree to be a donor after death. And you don't need a stated consent. While the opposite approach is described on the right-hand side, which means that if you want to become a donor, you actually have to sign a written consent and state your intentions in your medical records or by filling out a special donor form. There are different legal regulations across the world, and healthcare systems are unable to provide the right technologies to everyone in need. And that results in an inequality, unequal access to the new technologies problem. Let's take a look at the global map. This is a typical donor and a typical recipient. These are the main characteristics. Take a look at what countries they live in. These are Pakistani villagers, and 80% of the adults actually sold at least one of their kidneys. Donorship tourism is a trend that we are all seeing. What do we do to prevent crimes in this domain? It's an open question. The jury is still out on that. Another border that is disappearing is the border between biological species. One of the donors that could solve the problem of the deficit of donors' organs could be the xenotransplantation, which means that we would use genetically modified organs transplanted from animals. Of course, there are some scientific challenges that remain to be overcome, and this is what science and technology constantly do. However, if we erase the borders between the species, if chimera is not going to be just a character from the fables or a decoration for various churches, then it might become a problem. For instance, if your body contains genetic material or organs or even cells from a different species, then the question is, are we truly humans? What's the limitation? What's the limit of the embodiment that defines our identity? Yet another border which is disappearing right now is the difference between a human and a machine. In other words, an organic matter and non-organic matter. Neuro-implanted interfaces, various other devices that could be installed into a human body, for instance, heart pacemaker, could save lives. However, if you combine a human body with a device, you have to realize that it increases the dependency on humans on devices, and there is a problem of hacking the devices. Just imagine a risk facing a person with a pacemaker, or if you have to use an insulin pumping device, which is a wearable. And this slide shows photos of people who use various cyber devices. Neil Harbison had an osteo-integrated antenna. His pathology is an extremely difficult one. He is colorblind, and this particular device allows him to identify the color waves by means of sound signals. Well, you all know that both the color and the sound propagate in waves. He recently visited Moscow and he stated that he cannot imagine living without this device. Nigel Eklund has an artificial arm which is so advanced that they say that can actually tie his shoelaces. Just imagine what kind of fine movements are necessary to be able to tie your shoelace. Shown in the left-hand bottom corner is Moon Ribas, who is a professional dancer. She wanted to see the moves of her partners behind her. She had no diseases, no pathologies whatsoever, but she still integrated a device in her head to be able to track everything happening behind her. And in the right bottom corner, you see a British professor who has a subcutaneous microchip which is connected to a similar chip in the body of his wife, and they share data with each other. For instance, you might inform your partner that you experienced some hormonal explosion at a certain point of period of time, or if you want to ask your spouse to fill in a warm bath for you, you can do that without doing anything. Another important thing to mention is that now there is almost no difference between the norm and a pathology. This slide lists a number of interventions, embodiment interventions that we won't be able to discuss in detail. However, doping drugs, HR hormone replacement therapies, neurotransmitters that can change the moods are good examples. Changing sex, aesthetic transformations, and even definitive lifespan extension make it impossible to use purely scientific criteria to discern between the norm and the pathology. What is good? What's a therapy for maintaining the life, and what exactly do we mean by enhancement? This photo depicts a Finnish skier who back at the Olympics in the 1960s won lots of gold medals, and everyone was surprised because he did not differ much externally from his competitors, and he exercised as much as the next guy. But then it turned out that he was a mutant. He had a natural mutation that resulted in consequences that would be similar to those if you took doping drugs, enhancement drugs that were prohibited. But it's a natural mutation, therefore no one challenged the fact that he won a number of races. However, contemporary technologies allow us to generate such mutations on purpose. There is such a definition as genetic doping, and it's hard now to identify the root cause, whether it's natural or artificially induced. And our perceptions change all the time. We tend to applaud to the Olympians, and we also applaud to the Paralympians. However, there is now such a thing as Bionic Games, and these are events for people who integrated cyber devices into their bodies. And now we're using these technologies to save the lives of those who were injured in car crashes or any other disasters. Who's there to guarantee that in the future these technologies will not be applied to perfectly healthy humans who, for some other reasons, such as commercial, personal, or just for the sake of hype, well, I hate this word, but nevertheless, some people might want to modify their bodies just for the sake of hype. For the humankind, it's difficult to stick to the limitations because the number of exceptions is too high. Values might change and the goals might change, and the range is extreme. There is almost no difference between the norm and the pathology, and the neuroscience and neurobiology study of this phenomenon. This slide shows two main ideas that we mean by the neurotechnologies. First and foremost, this is a way to understand better how the brain works. And the second definition is about impacting the functionality of the nervous system. Let me give you an example from the educational domain. People believe that neurotechnologies can help students to overcome cognitive problems. For instance, some special categories of school kids might use these neurotechnologies. However, on the opposite, people might believe that they suffer from some cognitive problems. For instance, they might not be satisfied with the level of their concentration or their memory capacity, and they would still want to use these neurotechnologies. Will, in that case, education become a competition and a showing off by various families to be able to afford a VR helmet or other technology? Nootropic drugs might become might result in a race by the pharmaceutical companies. So what I'm saying is that the technological advance is outpacing our ability to answer some humanitarian issues. The main idea that drives us right now is to start applying these technologies to human beings. In other words, to hack a human body. Biohacking is a very ambiguous term. Of course, I'm not saying that I'm against the development of medical and healthcare technologies. This is not so. However, I believe that there should be we should discern between the soft biohacking and the hard biohacking. Biohackers, even nowadays, show that there is a definite contradiction between the goals and the outcomes of their behavioral patterns. They want to demonstrate that aging is no longer a problem, and on the other hand, they start depending on the drugs that they intake. And it turns out that no one is healthy. Healthcare is now about forecasting the various pathologies. But rather, we should put an emphasis on preventing pathologies. Are humans becoming healthier if they convert their homes into a clinical lab? If they start spending money on various drugs? Well, you might say that for the time being, these technologies are expensive, but people experiment on their own selves so that these technologies become more affordable in the future to a greater number of people. Let's be honest. Technologies like that will never be made affordable to everyone. Social and economic inequality is a fact of life, and biotechnologies will further aggravate this inequality. Let's take a look at an example of Russian biohackers. These are people who experiment with their own bodies. They voluntarily sign written consents, but they don't read between the lines because they give a consent to transform the very nature of their lives. Let's take a look at another category of problems that stem from the fact that various components of a human embodiment or biomaterials could be removed from a human being, could be preserved in the so-called biobanks. And the biobanks is a brand new phenomenon. They've only appeared at the dawn of the 21st century, but the development rates are huge. And we're not talking about the semen banks only. We're talking about population scale biobanks. Biomaterials and biodata derived from biomaterials are coupled with the way people lived their lives, what diseases they fell sick to, what kind of lifestyle they led.
So the biobanks can really help to develop the pharmaceutical industry, especially at the stage of preclinical studies. They can be used to test certain medicinal products for safety. But of course, biobanks quite often are purely commercial enterprises. Therefore, there is an interest to acquire patent protection for all of the discoveries made by biobanks, because patents protect the knowledge in the age of commercialization. You all know the story of Henrietta Lacks and the Henrietta Lacks cell line. So the HeLa cell line was started with the cells from Henrietta Lacks when she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. It turned out that this HeLa cell line is truly immortal. It can be sent by regular mail. Since then, a lot of anti-tumor products are tested using HeLa cell line, but Henrietta Lacks never consented to that. Back in the time, of course, medicine didn't really ask people for informed consent. And to tell you the truth, the technologies can also be quite unpredictable. It is sometimes quite difficult to ask a person about something that the science will only discover 10 or 15 years later. Therefore, Henrietta Lacks's relatives turned to court demanding the pharmaceutical companies to share part of their profits, the profits that they made selling anti-tumor drugs that were discovered using Henrietta Lacks's cells. The court ruled against them. So it turns out, on the one hand, we can be quite altruistic. We can donate our bodies to science. We can donate our biological materials to science, therefore spearheading the progress. But on the other hand, we cannot be given objective answers to everything. It is a watershed, seminal moment for medicine. People are saying that the future of medicine is 4P medicine: personalized medicine, predictive medicine, preventive medicine, and patient-oriented medicine. Therefore, if the science can already tell us what's going to happen to our bodies tomorrow or the day after, then what kind of diseases we will develop, then we have to ask ourselves, are we ready to know this information? Do you want to know your future? You can probably remember the example of Angelina Jolie. She was diagnosed with a BRCA mutation. BRCA mutation entails a very significant risk for breast and cervical cancer. In Angelina Jolie's family, she lost many relatives due to cancer. Therefore, Angelina Jolie opted for a preventative surgery. She didn't have the disease. She had the surgery to prevent the disease. Can you just imagine? You come for a consult to your doctor. You bring in a thumb drive that contains the data about the genome of your child. Or let's say your doctor connects to a certain database and he or she gets the information what kind of pathologies can your child develop. So what are you going to do in this situation as parents? Are you going to impose limitations on your child's future occupation? Can you tell your child you cannot be a chemist because you have a lot of allergies? Therefore, it's going to transform traditional relationships in the society. We will have discrimination. There is a danger of stigmatization, but at the same time, we should take into account the progress of medicine. Today, during the COVID-19 pandemic, people have started talking about immunization passports, something to prove that a person had the virus or got vaccinated. This is not too dissimilar to genetic passports, and you do know that the creation of genetic passports, providing passports to the entire population, not only would foster the development of medicine and healthcare system, well, that is something that is being discussed in this country as well as in other countries. So here, of course, we have to take into account new social technologies. In Iceland, the parliament passed a motion to create a biobank. It is not that each citizen of Iceland gave their consent to create this biobank. No, it was a private enterprise, a private company that used the money from American venture funds to set up a bank to store the genes of the entire country. In bioethics, we have a golden standard that regulates all manipulations, medical, experimental, by means of an informed consent. But when it comes to biobanks, they just get biological material from a person and they can use it in an unrestricted manner for whatever purpose. We are talking about genetization of society. But the only way to truly think and be aware of the consequences is probably through art. You see pictures on the slide from an interesting exhibition. An artist went to public spaces and she collected different items that contained some biological materials of random people. When you chuck away a cigarette butt, you probably are not thinking that there is your saliva on the cigarette butts. But today we have technologies that allow us to extract this genetic material and to use it to reconstruct you. Of course, this is not a very accurate reconstruction, but again, that is something that's already been used in criminal science. These technologies were used by the artists to create art. And through this art, she was trying to remind everybody that today, genetic material and all of the information within our genome is not something that belongs to you as an individual. It is not just something intrinsic. On the contrary, it is the information that can be used, for example, to find you a perfect match. A genetic match that will not only result in healthy offspring, but will also bring you more trust and more love. We all have seen ads about genetic Tinder that uses human DNA to develop a matching app. So are we ready as a species to substitute trust and love by rational thought about dangers and risks? So let's draw some intermediary conclusions. Science and technology are developing very rapidly, and they are developing much faster than we can think about legal, ethical, and philosophical problems. We do not have any ready solutions. Human beings are transformed in different ways. Therefore, the relationship between the biological and the social, why are we different? Well, we all have unique genes and we all develop in a unique environment. So this notion is truly changing today. We cannot say that biological is something of nature. We cannot say that something is natural, because it can be natural by function, by artificial, by manufacture. So all of the technologies that I mentioned today and other technologies which I didn't mention can be used to achieve different targets, not just when it comes to treatment, but also when it comes to hard hacking, because science cannot always determine what it is, what it means to be an enhanced individual. How can we look at the relationship between the collective and the individual good? And of course, here we can say that one of the extremes is to eliminate the corporality. We can say that a human being is pure mind. And when it comes to mind, nobody can really define what mind is. Many psychologists, philosophers, or neuroscientists cannot truly define the mind. Therefore, a human life, a human death, and the blurred lines between humans and machines, they all come down to people's decisions. Therefore, we understand that in making these decisions, or people can base these decisions on very opposing values. Therefore, we are talking about the rise of new eugenics. So people can be divided into those more and less deserving. And then again, that is something that we have to continue bringing into the sphere of public debate. And we have to talk about it, not just within our government institutions or social institutions or within the church, but any regular individual, any person from the street can make a personal choice, and this personal choice can influence whether a certain technology will take hold, whether it will become a part of a regular person's life. Every human being can sway public opinion in favor or against a certain technology. And of course, personal choice should always go hand in hand with personal responsibility. And this should be a choice that must remain mindful and informed. We need to face new challenges. We need to find answers to new questions. What is a human being? What is good? And to what extent do I want to enhance myself, especially if I pause and think that there are people in the world who have different values, and still we need to live as one community so we do not threaten the very existence of humankind and we do not intensify individual risks. Therefore, the questions which have traditionally been posed by philosophy, the so-called eternal questions, what it means to be human, what can I hope for? What can I do to be truly human? What does it mean to be part of human society? How do I find a balance between different values? These questions are becoming more and more urgent due to the emergence of biotechnologies. The influence of these technologies, their transformative nature when it comes to the essence of what it is, what it means to be human, can be intrinsically dangerous. What can we do to make sure that humankind continues to exist? This is a question that we should ask ourselves, both collectively and individually. And to conclude, I would like to give you a quote from Aldous Huxley. You probably know that two protagonists were talking. You probably know this quotation. One of the protagonists says, I don't want comfort, I want God, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, I want sin. In fact, said Mustafa Monge, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. All right then, said the savage defiantly, I'm claiming the right to be unhappy, not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence. I claim them all, said the savage at last. Therefore, claim your rights. What will be your position? What do you think? Therefore, my lecture is not just a talk, it's an invitation to talk. Let's talk using philosophy, let's talk using art. Thank you very much for your attention.
Елена Владимировна, спасибо большое.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think Elena disconnected already, but Elena touched on many very important issues in her talk. She talked a lot about what it is to be normal. Where are the lines between life and death? What defines us as human? How can people use assisted technologies to enhance the human body? And Elena said that her talk is not just a talk, it's an invitation to talk. Therefore, we would like to give the floor to Konstantin Deblikov. He is a popularizer of modern prosthetics. He will tell us about his opinion and how system-based technologies can be used. Hello, everyone. You know, it feels quite weird to talk after such a brilliant lecturer who preceded me. It was a truly fascinating talk, but today I am talking to you two matters that are more grounded. But I wanted to talk to you about something that I encounter every day. I want to tell you about the progress of assisted technologies, the progress that we reached not theoretically and not through philosophical constructs. I wanted to talk to you about very pragmatic problems of people with amputated limbs and what does the current level of scientific development can give me here and now. The question that I will try to answer in my talk will be, can technologies help people be happy? What is the role of new technologies in the eternal question or in the internal quest for human happiness? But let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am not a scientist myself. I lost my arm 6 years ago after an accident, and that's when I became truly interested in bionic prosthetics, in bionic limb prosthetics, and I try to popularize high-tech prosthetics, and I try and help people to get free prosthetics in Russia. By the way, this is a very complicated subject matter in this country, but that is something that I work with. I am also a blogger, and in my blog I talk about prosthetics. I take part in photo shoots as a model, and again, let me tell you one more time, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a humanist, I'm not a scientist, so everything that I'm going to share with you today is my personal experience, but the experience which is shared by people who had to look for new robotic limb prosthetic. On this slide, you see a definition provided on the website of WHO, and this definition talks about assistive technologies. What are these assistive technologies? Well, basically, if you look at the definition, all of the technologies can be defined as assistive technologies. For instance, smartphones, computers, cars, all of these technologies assist you because these technologies allow us to function in the modern world. And of course, when it comes to arm prosthetics or other technologies that we can describe as a technical means of rehabilitation, well, this is a more narrow category when it comes to assistive technologies. Therefore, today, well, due to personal reasons, I will talk about arm prosthetics. Therefore, all of the ideas and thoughts that I want to share with you today are related to upper limb prosthetics. When it comes to any area of human knowledge, or when it comes to the developments of rehabilitation technologies, of course, the progress that we've made can be quite different. In some areas, people achieved outstanding results, but when it comes to prosthetics, I think that all of the great things still remain ahead of us. One more disclaimer. I call state-of-the-art robotic prosthetics as bionic prosthetics. So that is something that is widely accepted. So we're talking about bionic prosthetics. But if you were to look at a classic definition, then a bionic prosthetic is any prosthetic that is anthropomorphous in its nature, which means that it looks like a human arm or a leg. Therefore, any prosthetic that looks like a human arm or hand can be a bionic prosthetic. But in the modern culture, we believe that a bionic prosthetic is a state-of-the-art, high-tech prosthetic. Therefore, today I will be talking about bionic prosthetics.
Let me share with you some of the myths which are quite popular and why I criticize the bionic prosthetics development as of today. This slide is a photo of a Soviet engineer who developed the first bionic arm prosthetics. And one of the common mistakes is that bionic arms is something that appeared just in the past 10 to 20 years. These are cutting-edge technologies. Well, it's totally different. The very first artificial arm was developed back in 1956 in the then Soviet Union, and in 1961 the artificial arm was launched into mass production in the Soviet Union and in Europe. Therefore, saying that bionic arms is something brand new or cutting edge is not worthwhile. But of course, it goes without saying that the artificial arm that was developed back in 1956 was not portable because the storage batteries were too large in size, and right now the storage batteries are way smaller. That's why the bionic arms became a possibility. But in terms of technology, nothing new has been invented since 1956. Unfortunately, this is really so, and this is a fact of life. The second myth I wanted to touch upon is shown on the next slide. This is the main flowchart that describes the Soviet artificial arm functionality, and the principle is still the same. I currently feature two German-produced artificial arms, and they follow the very same basic principles inside the artificial arm, which goes over my head. Has two electrodes. One of them touches the muscles on the one side of the forearm, and the other one touches the muscles on the other side of the forearm. When I flex my muscle on the inside, then my hand flexes, and vice versa. When your digits are open, what you need to do is flex your muscles. You get a sound signal, and I know that I'm gonna form a fist right now. So basically, I use the very same muscles. I flex the very same muscles to form a fist out of these digits. Two muscles, two electrodes, and the way they flex. This is it. And it has nothing to do with the way we control our natural limbs, meaning arms and legs. You don't have to think about flexing your muscles, you just do it. And in this particular case, the management principle has nothing to do with the neural activity. But it has to do with the muscles. Well, the right name is the myoelectrical artificial arm. Therefore, all these stories saying that you use your brain to control your artificial arm, these ideas are totally wrong, because people believe that contemporary artificial arms are awesome because they can be controlled by brain. Unfortunately, this is not really true, but I'm gonna give you more info on the origins of these myths. This slide also features a number of important features. The osteo-integrated prosthetic is shown on the left-hand side. Actually, only a titanium implant has been integrated into his body, while the artificial limb itself is put over the implant. This technology has been in use, in wide use, for the past 15 years, and basically there is no sense in integrating the prosthetics into your body, because they are controlled through the very same flexing motions I just described to you. The only advantage this person has is that he doesn't have to wear the part that goes over your limb. Thus, maybe in summertime he's not as hot as I am. But otherwise, there are no other advantages coming from the implanted artificial arm. On the other hand, there is always an open wound on your limb, thus you need to treat the implantation site so as not to get infected. You have to replace it at a certain time interval, because it's not a lifelong device. Therefore, osteo-integrated prosthetics is not a work stream that will see further development, I would say, because given the current management technique, it doesn't make any sense. Shown on the right-hand side is a photo that was taken during one of the research projects. It was about sensibilizing the artificial arms. The scientists try to ensure some feedback from the artificial arm. Right now, they are not sensitive. I cannot discern between a cold thing or a hot thing. I cannot find my way around in a dark room. I will just sense that there is an obstacle on my way, but there is no sensitivity in the artificial arm. Unfortunately, for the time being, not a single product sold out there in the market is sensitive yet. Right now, everything is at a stage of lab tests. So prosthetic arms are not controlled with the help of the brains. It doesn't make any sense to implant them, and they are not sensitive. This is what we have to deal with in the year of 2021, and I guess looking forward, we will still face this challenge for years to come. The next slide shows a bunch of photos that identifying the root cause of the myth around the prosthetic arms being state-of-the-art technology. Sci-fi, starting from the 1950s, has been promoting the following paradigm. A human being with a mechanical device which is as good as your natural limb, or that could replace your arm or your leg. Computer games, movies reproduce this myth all the time. And people like to think that an injury or an amputation is not a limiting factor, and that science and technology will quickly get you back to your initial state, or even enhance you and make you better than you were before the injury. And reporters like writing articles about the fact that artificial arms are controlled with the help of a brain, or that a brand new prosthetic arm has been invented. It is controlled with the help of the neural signals. Well, first and foremost, reporters are not real experts, and they don't tend to deep dive into the subject they write about. And there's also always wishful thinking. People want to believe that science is omnipotent and enables people to become superhumans. But unfortunately, like I said, this is not true. And the next slide in my PPT stack depicts the most state-of-the-art artificial arms that are offered in the market. You can buy them, they're commercially available. These are not lab prototypes. As for their shelf price, it's difficult to give you a shelf price because the prices change all the time, but I guess 3 to 6 million Russian rubles is an average price of the hands that you see on your screens. You might ask me what is the difference between them? Actually, basically there is no difference. Like I said, all the artificial arms are controlled with the help of two flexors that you flex or relax, and they differ in certain features which are not really significant. The difference is as slight as that between iPhone 11 and iPhone 12. The most advanced hands are faster, but there is no much difference, like I said. The one shown on the right-hand side, the one in middle shows a white finger, which means that you can use touchpads. For instance, I don't have both arms, and if you want to use a touch screen on your smartphone or on your table, you have just one digit out of 5 that is capable of controlling touchpads. It's strange to see that out of 4 artificial hands that are produced in 2021, just one features a white digit capable of controlling touchpads. It just goes to show you that the prosthetics industry is really slow. the producers seem to be unable to keep up with the rapid changes happening with the humans. Therefore, oftentimes, people with no limbs have, well, with no arms in particular, have to come up with their own ways to be able to operate and navigate touchscreens. For instance, my dad and I invented a brand new technology for me to be able to use a smartphone with the help of the artificial arms. Unfortunately, upper limb prosthetics industry is not as fast as I would like it to be. Let me put it this way. Oh yeah, like I said, the prices are extremely high, several million Russian rubles. Well, it's quite clear that it's an expensive technology which cannot be afforded by everyone, but it's not a huge bunch of money, especially if you realize that that it's once in a life purchase. Let's say you find somewhere a couple of million Russian rubles, you buy a artificial arm, but the warranty period is just 2 years, which means that it will fail sooner or later, and they fail sooner rather than later, especially if you use them all the time. So you will have to pay more to repair them, and the repairs are also expensive. Sometime down the line it will fail altogether, which means that you will have to find 3 more million Russian rubles to be able to replace it with a brand new bionic artificial arm. This is a reality that we have to live in if you want to use a high-tech bionic artificial arm. My next slide shows a photo from the Bionic Games mentioned by Elena during the previous presentation. And this photo depicts the winner in the Cyberthlon. Let me say a few words about the Bionic Games themselves. Actually, producers of all artificial limbs come to one place. These are top transnational companies down to startups created and spun off by students, and they all display their artificial limbs, including artificial arms. And users have to use these artificial limbs to go over, well, how do I put it, an obstacle course, which requires certain activities from that. The main idea is to compare bionic prosthetics in a real use case scenario to better understand how they can function in real life. Both in 2016 and in 2020, it's not the bionic high-tech artificial arms that cost several million win the race, but actually it's the classical rod-operated artificial arms that win the races. These are not battery-operated, but these are rod-operated arms. There is a bunch of rods that you put in your body, and when you extend your limb, then the arm opens up. If you pull it back, then the hand closes down. It's a well-known, time-proven technology. Everyone is aware of that. And what's interesting is that this particular technique always turns out to be a winner. The most cutting edge and the most expensive bionic arms for the time being are unable to outpace the hook classical prosthetics. By the way, this is the most popular in the world prosthetic arm. Even in the States, it is more popular than the bionic arms. And the reason for that is quite simple. It's way more cheaper than the bionic, as opposed to the bionic arm. It can grab both small and large objects. The repairs are not expensive. The overall costs are low. In other words, there are a bunch of advantages. As for disadvantages, well, I guess it's morally obsolete. This is the main disadvantage. And of course, you want an amputee to wear something awesome, something cool that creates an image of a cyborg, confirming that the technologies are advanced, but unfortunately this is still the most functional prosthetic arm, and for the foreseeable future I believe it will stay that way. Okay, let's move on. And now let me just say a few words about the cost and the affordability of the artificial arms. Would you please display my next slide on the screen? Most of owners of most of the amputees do not have artificial arms. Unfortunately, I cannot share with you the precise statistics on the number of people in Russia who want to have an artificial arm and those who already have one. But it's the minority that was provided with the artificial arms. The reason for that is basically the prohibitive cost of all the advanced artificial arms I demonstrated to you. According to the law, it's the state who is to fund and finance the provisioning of the artificial arms to the amputees. In real life, it's difficult to get one. And this is a headache for me. This is something that I specialize in. And the next slide shows the journey of an average person who needs and who wants to get an advanced artificial arm free of charge. By the way, one of the applicable Russian laws says that a person can get rehab procedures free of charge. However, the process of getting the state to fund and finance one of such artificial arms takes a year to a year and a half in Russia. Well, in Moscow it will be faster, in the regions it will take even longer, but it's a very challenging process. The primary reason for that is that these artificial arms cost a lot. And if and they have to be replaced once every 2 to 3 years, like I said, which is even more expensive. So I guess the situation is not going to change for the better. Amputees will either have no artificial arms, or they will keep on trying to make the state finance the procedure. The prohibitive costs result in yet another problem, which I tried to show in the next slide. Amputees in Russia are susceptible to marketing campaigns by prosthetics producers. By the way, marketing is another pain point for me. Well, let me give you the following example. When I had my arms amputated and I was still in hospital, I was called by a lady who somehow learned that my arms were amputated, and she started insisting that I buy prosthetics from a Finnish company that she represented. She tried to convince me that this is something that I needed, and so on and so forth. Like I said, an amputee faces a number of challenges, a number of questions, and it's difficult for a person to navigate in this market. And non-bona fide stakeholders present in this industry tend to grab a person and say, well, why don't you come to us? We're gonna provide you with an artificial arm that will be similar to your natural arm, and it's gonna look as if you had never suffered an injury. Well, and you tend to think, well, I'm gonna go there because what I need to ensure is that my artificial arm is as good as the natural one. And you go there, and it doesn't happen that way. Or you are told that you're going to become a cyborg, that your capabilities would be enhanced, and that you will be a better person. And you say, wow, I got lucky, this is something that I need, and you go get an artificial arm that enables you to pay for your goods in a store, because there is an NFC chip integrated into artificial limb. And it's an awesome capability, because ordinary people cannot pay for their purchases with their arms, and you can. But on the other hand, this very arm will not be able to hold a single object. It's not sensitive, you cannot manage it, therefore you can hardly say that you have become a cyborg. Well, I call myself a cyborg both in Instagram and in social media, but this is my conscious choice. This is an image. This is the way I position myself, but it has nothing to do with the real capabilities of my prosthetic arm. And you can hardly say to a just recent amputee that you can become a cyborg. I believe it's totally wrong. This is misleading such people. It could be considered to be non-bona fide marketing and advertising. So marketing in the prosthetic industry is a very slippery path, and it's a pain point for me. Like I said, well, I've been talking about that for quite some time. So let's move on to the next slide. This slide is basically some food for thought. Why do artificial limbs look like they're anthropomorphous? Why would a metal limb, which has lots of servers inside, why would it need 5 digits? Why would it need to look anatomically similar to a natural limb?
And here we have a number of really cool projects. For instance, the British Alternative Limb Project. They come up with really fascinating designs. Of course, these prosthetics are non-functional. You can see the picture on the right. That's probably not very convenient to walk on. And this tentacle-looking prosthetic is not, again, something that you can use in everyday life. But again, these are conceptual designs so that we ask ourselves the question, how should prosthetics look? And why should they look like natural limbs? And the last question that I wanted all of us to ask ourselves, do we actually need prosthetics? And do really prosthetics guarantee somebody a very happy and successful life? On this slide, you see Jessica Cox. She is from the United States. She was born without arms, and she is a small aircraft pilot. She passed all of the piloting exams. She can pilot an aircraft with her legs. She doesn't use prosthetics. She doesn't really need prosthetics. She can use her legs, as I've already said, and she can do everything that a regular pilot can do. Therefore, human beings are not really limited by their existing physical situation, but they're limited by legal regulation. For instance, it is hard to imagine that somebody born without arms will be able to pilot an aircraft in Russia. It's quite impossible. A person without arms in Russia cannot even drive a car. So basically, when it comes to opportunities or things that people with amputations can do, well, here all of the limitations do not come from physical limitation, but rather from societal and legal limitations, when societies tell people this is something that you can and cannot do. So that probably answers the question that I just asked you. Well, what will make us happy is not a really cool high-tech prosthetic, but rather an opportunity for self-realization that will come without resistance from the public or the society. Therefore, an ability to live a full life comes down to what's in your mind, but not to which limbs are missing. So this is the last slide. I advertise my Instagram account here. So this concludes my talk, but if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer or give you more detail. Thank you very much. Do we have questions? Thank you very much, Konstantin. Could you please tell us how exactly do you help people to get prosthetics? Well, now I work through personal consultations. I work on a case-by-case basis. I am quite visible online, so people write to me, they ask me how they can do this or that, and I even have pre-prepared answers that I send to people so that I tell them what should be done, who they should turn to. It is probably not the most efficient way to operate, functioning on a case-by-case basis. That's why I decided to develop a website together with the Lebedev studio. The site will be called the Bionic Russia. And using this web platform, we will talk about everything that's happening in the field of prosthetics in Russia. What is the purpose of this website? Let's say somebody wakes up in an ICU after a car accident without a leg. They can log on to our website and straight away this person will understand what it is that needs to be done, because usually when limb amputation happens in Russia, nobody really can give you the answers what should be done next, what kind of prosthetics exist, how you can get access to these prosthetics. And even if this information is available, it is written in such hard to understand legalese that nobody can actually make heads or tails out of it. Therefore, we decided to launch a website that will be very user-friendly and that would clearly explain to people the difference between different prosthetics, because you cannot just log in onto an online shop and look at different prosthetics. You cannot read people's reviews of different prosthetics. It is a very small, a very closed off market. There is not a lot of information. That is, of course, a disadvantage. People are not choosing a coffee maker, people are choosing a limb, and they cannot find information about a prosthetic limb online. But so that's why we've created the website. So basically, when somebody goes through an amputation, nobody actually explains to a person what needs to happen next. Yes, you're quite right. There is right now no support system in place, so people just end up being on their own. People might be told that, well, yeah, you should apply for welfare or benefits. Well, then people start thinking maybe I should get a prosthetic, and then people just Google, for instance, arm prosthetic, and so people get information, and the first 2 or 3 pages in Google will be, information about different companies selling prosthetics. So basically, after an amputation, a person is left alone with a lot of information and they cannot really make heads or tails of it. So basically, there is no legal or informational support. Well, it is not quite true. In Russia, we have a foundation that provides support to people with amputated limbs. But again, we're talking about tens of thousands of people in Russia. Therefore, one foundation is not sufficient. When it comes to psychological support, I've never really seen cases of people getting post-traumatic psychological support. Although, to tell you the truth, people did tell me that it exists in some form or another. But, in my experience, I talked to a lot of people with amputations and none of them got psychological support in Russia. Again, in Russia, usually you need to know where the psychological support is provided in which parts of the country, and you need to apply for it, but there is no single system. Thank you very much, Konstantin. Thank you very much for your talk. It was really inspiring. And I wanted to ask you to give us a little bit more information about your own prosthetic. Do you have MTM SIM cards in your prosthetics, or do you have any other high-tech solutions such as a microchip? No, I have classic prosthetics. So I do not, my prosthetics do not have anything to, let's say, enhance my capabilities. Of course, I can handle something that's hot, for instance, a hot pot, right? That is a plus. But for instance, I cannot use my prosthetic to make a phone call or to pay for a bus ride. Both of my prosthetics were made by Orthobock. It's a German company, so I can open it, I can close it, I can grab. And this one is a by Bionic 3 prosthetic. It has 14 grasp motions. And basically, all of the prosthetics have pluses and minuses. So there are some prosthetic limbs that allow people to do strenuous physical exercise. Some prosthetic limbs allow you to work in an office. For instance, this prosthetic limb is quite capricious. It can break easily, but it is pretty, and it brings me a lot of followers on Instagram. This prosthetic arm is not so pretty, but it is very convenient. Although it only has one grasp motion, it opens and closes, but still it allows me to grab objects of any size. It's easier, for instance, to put through coat sleeves, well, the size of the weight of a prosthesis, whether it needs to be repaired often or not. Well, again, all of these characteristics are different from one prosthetic limb to another. It is, a whole area of science. So that's why our website will be needed by people with amputations. Can I ask you one more question? I'm really interested in this topic because my company provides MTM SIM cards for prosthetic limbs. You mentioned that one prosthesis is German made. How did you get this prosthetic limb? Did you buy it out of pocket, or is there a co-payment scheme in Germany? Well, no, this is a prosthetic limb made in Germany, but it doesn't mean that I got it under co-pay in Russia. Well, these are German-made prosthetic limbs, but you can get them in any country where there is a representative office of Orthobock. So I got my first prosthetic limbs through crowdfunding, basically. And my story, the story of how I lost my arms, really resonated. Therefore, my friends and my colleagues, my associates, didn't have any difficulty collecting money for me online. You probably know that prosthetic limbs cost quite a lot. So we bought my first prosthetic limbs, and I've been getting my prosthesis for free from the government. I live in Voronezh, so I get it under the government's insurance scheme. Usually it takes about 18 months to get it free from the government. So right now I'm in the process of getting new prosthetic limbs. That is a very complicated process that brings on a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of hurt feelings, but unfortunately that is something that people in Russia have to go through. Of course, it all comes down to prosthetic limbs being very, very expensive. So first you submit an application, and it usually takes a long time between the application and getting a prosthetic limb. Konstantin, is it okay for you to wash your hands? But on a serious note, what do you think about Neuralink? Have you looked into it? Well, looking into it, well, as you said, studying it, well, no, I don't do that, but I do monitor the news about neural interfaces, and I do have a lot of hopes when it comes to Elon Musk, and I'm very hopeful about Neuralink, and I do believe that this interface will give me opportunities to control some peripheral devices using my brain waves. I do hope that it will be something that is affordable, something that doesn't cost a fortune. Prosthetic limbs are already quite expensive. Whether it will make prosthetic limbs natural, well, I think it will, and I think it will change the lives of hundreds of thousands of people with amputations. But I don't really wash my hands. I cannot get bionic prosthetics wet, so I use wet tissues. Would you sign up as a volunteer to test the Neuralink? No, I wouldn't want to be one of the first volunteers. I think that it should be tested on people who do volunteer. Once the product is finished, then I, wouldn't be against getting it myself. One more question. Would you like to contribute to prosthetic development? Well, I actually worked with a number of companies who develop prosthetic limbs in Russia. I already mentioned Motorica. I also worked with another company from St. Petersburg. So I tested their prosthetic prototypes, and I gave them feedback about what needs to be changed, what needs to be improved. So that was my relationship with prosthetic developers. But I wouldn't say that's actually contributed a lot. Well, for a number of years, there was a problem that companies who made prosthetic devices didn't actually get feedback from people who would wear these devices in the future. The engineers would develop prosthetic limbs based on the notion of what they thought would be the optimal solution. They didn't actually know what people felt, people who would wear these prosthetic limbs. And I would say that in the last couple of years, there was a seminal shift. All of these prosthetic developers started working with people with amputations. So it is just the start of the journey for us. I think it will take several decades for us to achieve this cyborgization that we see in video games or movies. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? Thank you very much, Konstantin. My question might surprise you. I'll try to word my question so it's clear. You also had a slide in your presentation. There were people who were born without limbs, such as Nick Vujicic. He's in the same situation, that he looks different to other people. But there are people who choose to use prosthetics, and there are people who choose not to. Do you think that these people are, from different worlds? I know that today there's a consulate general from Italy who has problems with one of his arms. And he also chose not to go for prosthetics. So some people choose prosthetics and some people opt out. Have you experienced it? I think you're so focused on the fact that you do need a prosthetic limb. Well, how did you make this decision? Maybe you don't need it. Maybe you can focus your life or efforts on something else. When did you decide it, and what spurred on that decision? Well, I do not really think that I was very mindful about making this decision. That is something that seemed right. So when, you end up being after an amputation, you think, okay, I need to go for a prosthetic. But people who are born without limbs, more often than not, if these people were not trained in the usage of prosthetics when they were kids, and they never use prosthetics, so they accept their body quite easily without prosthetics, and of course they can learn to do everything that is possible to do without a prosthetic. And I think that it all comes down to personal choice, especially taking into account how hard it is to get prosthetic in Russia. Prosthetic limb can break frequently. It can bring on a lot of frustration, and basically it always creates some sort of suffering. So it all comes down to personal choice. Talking about me, well, I think I went for an internet cyborg option. That's why I'm into prosthetics. Let's say if I lived somewhere in the country, if I had a different set of values, then I probably wouldn't opt for a prosthetic. I would probably learn to do everything without limbs. But I think everybody has to have a possibility to make a choice. If somebody suffered a trauma, they have to be given a chance to make a choice. People need to be told you can live with the prosthetic, without the prosthetic. Nobody will give you a second glance. Nobody will ask you, what is it? So hide your stump, or what is this prosthetic? If there is an environment of acceptance, if all choices are okay, and then I think people will have an opportunity to say, okay, I'll live without a prosthetic. I will be more mindful about my life after the trauma. So basically, again, it's a personal choice. It depends on an individual's specific situation. It depends on the upbringing, society, acceptance, and so on. Thank you very much.
Konstantin, thank you so much for your presentation. Well, I might have missed something out because I came in late, but you talked about the bionic arms, and you also demonstrated the rod-based prosthetics, which are way cheaper, simpler, lighter, more convenient. So my question is, if they are so advanced in daily lives, why would people want to pay more for the bionic arms? Why would they need them? Are they willing to pay just for the looks? What's the logic underlying the overall approach? Well, let me put it this way. I can only speak for myself because I'm quite used to having an artificial arm operated by flexing muscles. It's really inconvenient for me to operate a rod-based prosthetic arm because if you have rods, the principles of moving your body are somewhat different. You have to use your back muscles and you have to get used to it. I'm not used to rod-based prosthetic arms. I don't like the way it operates. I do have several of them. I tried to use them, but I didn't like it. I know that some people still use Soviet-produced rod-based prosthetic arms, and they enjoy fine movements. For instance, women can apply cosmetics with the help of this prosthetic arm. If you are used to it, it's easy and it doesn't pose any problems. So much depends on whether you are used to it, whether it's part of your daily life. If you can get a bionic arm initially, then you will probably stay with bionic artificial arms. If you start using a rod-driven prosthetic arm, and if you get used to it, despite the fact that it's not really convenient, then you'll become a real master in operating it. Every single prosthetic arm has its own function. For instance, rod-driven prosthetic arms are cheap, easy to manufacture, easy to repair, and they are good for hard physical labor. For instance, you don't have to be concerned about breaking it when you carry something heavy around your house. While bionic arms are inconvenient for carrying something heavy around. A bionic arm is basically a myth created in the past 6 decades. People believe that bionic arms make their lives better, and they believe that bionic arms make them cyborgs. And people are willing to pay just for this perception, for this very notion. And prosthetic manufacturers sell this idea to them. This is a conscious marketing campaign. You're going to become a cyborg if you start using a bionic arm. And people are willing to pay millions just for this perceived illusion. In a nutshell, this is it. May I ask you another question? What happens with a person after he or she realizes that he or she is a person with disability? You decided to become a media person, but what about the senior citizens? If they lose both limbs, what do? I don't have an answer for that. There is no right answer to this question. We're all different. We all grew up in different families. Our parents display different attitudes towards us. We read different books, we watch different movies, and if you have your limb amputated, or if you are subjected to a very traumatic experience that drastically changes your life, then all these factors that define your life since very birth come up with, result in an outcome, and you respond in a certain way. Oftentimes people write to me and say, well, it's beyond my imagination. How can you actually live after your limb is amputated? We don't know what we are capable of. No one knows what the limitations of a human body are. You don't know how you're gonna respond to an extreme and scary situation. So it's hard to say what a person would do much would depend on a specific individual, on his line of work. I know that amputees with their arms removed can take up anything, starting from art and up to field labor. If you Google armless driver, you'll see lots of stories covered by regional and federal TV channels about amputees who can work as taxi drivers, as cab drivers. You can become a software developer. Denis Udovenko is a good example. He had both arms amputated, and he still works as a software developer. So much depends on what you want to do, on your skills, and I guess that will predefine further work. I guess you have experienced the state support in inverted commas. How well does the state support the amputees, both in terms of finding the jobs for them and so on? Well, as for the social security and the social benefits, job placement, these are things that I am not an expert on. I never deep dived into these issues. I don't want to say that, well, we live in Russia, therefore you will probably get no support. I have no clue what's going to happen. But I do know that, unfortunately, this is not specific. This is not a problem which is specific for Russia. In Russia, it's difficult to get an artificial limb. You might say that this is typical for Russia, and this is it. Actually, there is not a single country in the world that would provide its citizen with a high-tech artificial arm right after an injury within several months. This is not the case. In the UK, people have to crowdfund expensive artificial arms. In the US, if you don't have a medical insurance, you will never be able to afford an expensive artificial arm, and you will have to save for it. So basically, affordability of prosthetic limbs is a global problem. And I cannot say that the situation is much worse in Russia than anywhere else. So you're saying that the state does not offer much support and people should support each other. Well, MPOs is a third player. We have a foundation set up for amputees, and I hope that there will be more funds like that, and they will be they'll be able to support more people after injuries in Russia. Thank you. Well, this is a very relevant topic, since lots of questions were asked by the audience. Any other questions from the floor? We don't have any questions from the YouTube chat. In that case, Konstantin, thank you so much for your presentation. And I guess we can move on. And we have a very busy schedule for today. We're not gonna make any breaks. And now I'm gonna introduce to you our next presenter. That's Melinda Hall, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Stetson University, and she specializes in bioethics, continental philosophy, and the philosophy of disability. The title of her lecture is Bioethics of Improvement. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
And thank you very much for having me today. I'm excited to talk about strong enhancement promoters. That is transhumanists, who are a group of philosophers and also laypersons and people all over the world who believe that it's very important to enhance the human body. Indeed, they believe that human enhancement might be a moral obligation. So I will talk through definitions of enhancement and transhumanism. I will talk through the idea that I have of disability and my concepts. And then I will make some remarks about this point of view, which I criticize. I am not against technology. I'm often very excited about technology, but I want to see it used for disabled people, not on disabled people. And that is a lot of what I'm going to be chatting about today. And so I'd appreciate it if there is a problem with my audio or my presentation, if the moderators could send me a direct message while I'm presenting, that would be very helpful. So again, my overview today is that I'll be talking about transhumanists. Transhumanist thinkers are the sort of strongest thinkers of human enhancement. And along with those who claim that enhancement is a moral obligation, I argue that there is a perspective here that denigrates disabled embodiment and disabled lives. In fact, when people talk about enhancing the human body, they often link the idea of disability with risk, with the idea of a riskiness or vulnerability that gets in the way of a good life. And so I think that you are open, if you have this kind of argument, to significant what we might call disability critique. That is, despite the fact that transhumanists often claim to be strong allies with disabled people, or with disability justice activism, I believe that they're not necessarily performing this alliance very well. I will lay out my disability critique of enhancement, and I'll further support my claims by pulling from a thinker that I often use, Foucault, Michel Foucault, a French thinker, and his notion of the biopolitical. I also will point to an alternative vision of enhancement. So I mentioned earlier that I really get excited about technology and think there's tons of potential there. So I'm going to try to pose a disability inclusive future, a vision of the world in the future that uses technology that is open and engaged to disabled people and to disability justice activism and that alliance that I mentioned earlier. I call this a sort of counter discourse of enhancement. So again, I mentioned the significance already, but I just wanted to go again mentioning the significance of this talk for today. So even though transhumanists are claiming that they make natural allies with disability justice activists, especially given that technology is very well integrated in the everyday lives of disabled people, and that's what transhumanists want. And they say that they're engaged in a fight for disability justice because disability justice is yielded by human enhancement. I call these claims seriously into question, serving a warning that current enhancement thinking is exclusionary for disabled persons. So that's the meaning, the overall significance, and the drive of my project. And it is connected to a book that I wrote. It was published in 2016 called The Bioethics of Enhancement. Of course, I strongly recommend that you check it out, but hopefully I'll be able to tell you some of the arguments for the book today. So let's talk for a few minutes about terminology. Again, each of the pieces of my argument, each of the pieces of terminology are in dispute. It's not clear what the conceptual definition should be. So first, enhancement is the improvement of existing capabilities or the addition of new capabilities through available intervention strategies. Now, I'll linger here just to say that in much of literature on bioethics, which again is sort of my arena, there's a distinction made between enhancement and therapy. So the idea is if it's not therapeutic, then it's enhancement. If it's not a medicine to bring you back up to some kind of baseline, then it counts as enhancement. But actually, transhumanists don't like this distinction. It doesn't make sense to them. And that's because for the transhumanist, every human body is in some way deficient and in need of improvement. So when you try to say that there's, on the one hand, medical interventions that count as therapies to bring you back up to some sort of normal, quote unquote, human level of functioning, and on the other hand, you have enhancement strategies which bring you above, that doesn't quite work with the transhumanist perspective because they feel that every body is in need of improvement. So I follow them in this definition since they are the ones that I am critiquing. Meanwhile, transhumanism, and this definition comes from Nick Bostrom, Oxford philosopher. He works at the Future of Humanity Institute and also leads that institute. He defines transhumanism as a sort of loosely defined movement that promotes an interdisciplinary approach to looking at understanding opportunities for enhancing the human condition and harnessing technology in order to do that. Now, I'm saying that transhumanist viewpoints are in conflict with disability justice, with disability activists, rights activists, and with disabled people. So I better say a little bit about disability as well. I do argue that disability is, of course, quite real, but it's not natural. It's social and political. That is, it's produced by the way that we build our world, by the way that we talk, so both institutionally and discursively. It's produced in a variety of ways. Even impairment, I would claim, is produced. So we may make a decision to go to war, which may result in injury. We may make a decision to over-police or under-police certain populations, which can unevenly distribute disability in the population. So even some people like to say disability is political and social, but impairment with the body isn't. I push back against that a little bit. I think that both are produced by circumstances, and by that I mean they could be otherwise. So they are real, disability and impairment, and I just want to make that very clear because sometimes there's, confusion about the meaning of social construction as a view. But they could be otherwise. And that's sort of my primary view about disability. There have been a lot of really interesting definitions coming out of literature recently. Elizabeth Barnes talks about disability as mere difference, not bad difference. Shelley Tremaine talks about disability as an expression of power relations. All of these definitions are sort of fodder for this view that disability is produced and it could be otherwise. So now I want to turn to the two transhumanist enhancement strategies that I want to talk about today. And I want to tell you what those strategies are. And then I want to tell you why I think they're in conflict with disability justice activism and with disabled people and the valuing of those persons' lives. So I could have chosen other strategies as well, but these two have a lot of impact and influence. Both Nick Bostrom, about whom I'll talk in a second, and Julian Savulescu, who I'll turn to next after Bostrom, run large institutions with many millions of dollars in budgets and are cited all over the world in academic literature and on the internet more widely among laypersons and academics alike. So I've chosen their primary favored strategies to talk about today. So the first is the strategy of transcending embodiment entirely. And the second is what I'm calling, just for ease, negative genetic selection. That is choosing against reproducing because of information that you glean by doing genetic testing. And there are a couple different ways that somebody might do that. Some might quibble with the use of the word negative here. I use negative because the decision is against reproduction. So again, Nick Bostrom, and here I have an image of Nick. I'm not sure the date of this image, but I just want to describe it for those who might be using screen readers or who are listening or doing something else. So providing an image description is something that I'll do today for this and my other images. Nick Bostrom is wearing horn-rimmed tortoiseshell glasses. He's a white male, and he's looking pensively off to the left as the camera takes his photograph. So Nick Bostrom has a very consistent view on human life. He's been very consistent throughout his publications, his written work, about what it is that makes life good and what our biggest problems are. So one of the big problems that he thinks we have is connected to our embodiment. He thinks that our goals and our lives are frustrated and interrupted by our bodily functionality, our sensory modalities, so the way in which we perceive the world through our ears, our eyes, even our taste, all these different ways in which we perceive. He wonders about our sort of like special faculties and sensibilities. What is it that humans can uniquely do? What is it that we sort of offer, and how can we interact with the world? He thinks that our goals are interrupted by these things because they're limited, right? We only have some modalities. We only have some sensibilities, and sometimes they may cause us more harm than good. Our perceptions may be wrong. Also, our mood isn't always high. It's not always excited. You know, we don't always have energy, and we don't always have self-control. So he worries that our embodiment can interrupt our goals. Secondly, he thinks our opportunity range is limited. In other words, we might only be able to accomplish X, but he wants for us to be able to accomplish X plus Y, or X plus Y plus Z. He thinks it's obvious that humans only have some opportunities, and if they received more opportunities, that would be better. Also, he argues that our lifespan being limited is a problem. He thinks that death is one of the biggest problems that humans face. And he wrote a short essay called The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant about this, that we're sort of being complacent and allowing a dragon to eat our loved ones. That dragon is death, and we should push back against that. We should do anti-aging therapy. Finally, he thinks our cognition is limited. We can't understand every book in the Library of Congress. He wishes we could, and there may be a cap even on our ability to discover things that are true. There might be philosophical or scientific truths out there that we can't understand because our cognition is limited. So what is his strategy for all of this? He wants to sort of overcome the body's fragility and save the intellect from the body. He's introducing a mind-body dualism. Maybe we upload our mind to silicon. Maybe we replicate our understanding, our thoughts and feelings, our personalities into a technological framework so that we don't have to worry about mood or lifespan. He writes in one piece, and this is a bit older now, from 2010, but he calls the body a self-combusting paper hut. He wants us to have secure homes, he says. He wants us to live better by having a different housing for our intellect. And he believes that we should work on this very hard, that it should be a priority for science, for loads of different fields. So he also argues that even if we can't imagine what it would be like to be enhanced people would definitely have a larger opportunity range. In other words, they would have X plus Y plus Z. And so that status is desirable. We know that we want a larger opportunity range, he argues, even if we don't know what that consists of. Now, I don't want to be too quick with my critique here. I've written a lot about Bostrom's thoughts and his arguments. I've written about this in a book. I've written about this in other publications. But I do think that there are some big problems that we can briefly discuss. First, this division between the body and the mind is suspect. Instead of treating the body as the opportunity to even have a desire in the first place, or the seat of our lives, that is, the body is the landing or platform up we build a life, he sees the mind as trapped within the body, right? And I think that there is a real danger here to misunderstand what it is that makes life good. But also, we know that we're body minds. A lot of disabled thinkers write this way. They say we're body minds. In other words, our body and our minds are so deeply interconnected that it's not quite sensible to consider ourselves as having a mind that's trapped somehow within fleshly embodiment. I also argue that more is not necessarily better. So I have a lot of really funny anecdotes about this, some of which might catch your imagination and some of which might not. But one is that, you know, when folks are presented with a buffet or a smorgasbord of foods, they're happy with the food that they ultimately end up eating and have a worse experience than if they had fewer items presented to them. So this is backed up by surveys and things like that. But that's a little bit of a silly or maybe easy example. I do believe that more choices, simply the multiplication of choices, doesn't make life more meaningful or enjoyable. Engagement does, the choosing of a choice. So our lives will always have a path or a pattern, and there are many other lives that we could have lived. But the fact that we didn't live those does not undermine the life that we're living. So I don't think that more choices or a larger opportunity range is necessarily better. I also think that transhumanism is not as progressive as it might seem. It's really humanism. It's the idea that the intellect is king and that we should use science to sort of conquer the world, but also ourselves. So it's extended to the human body itself. And there are foibles here. There are problems here. We might worry about what it means to be the dominating factor. We might worry about what it means to prize the intellect above all else. And I'm happy to talk more about that if people would like in the Q&A. Finally, well, a couple more points here. I don't think that I believe that there's an implicit connection between disability and death within his work. So any bodily vulnerability is something that's worth rejecting for him. So the fact that we're open to injury, instead of seeing that as a way to build meaning and have a life, that is the fear of throwing yourself into a whitewater rafting trip or something like that, or the limitation that causes you to enjoy the touch of a soft piece of material, the limitation being your body and its flesh. Those things are not worth being rejected. And so finally, even if Bostrom, and he has said that he's an ally to disabled people, I don't think he can be said to be an ally to those with cognitive disabilities. He says that the value of a human life, he analogizes to one written book per life. So there's at least, when somebody dies, we lose the opportunity of one written book, right? He very much intellectualizes human life and seems to be unable to deal with the idea that cognitively disabled or intellectually disabled people can have a good life. So secondly, now, I'd love to turn to Julian Savulescu. He's at the Uterus Center for Practical Ethics, which is also at Oxford. And he's written so much. His publications are voluminous, vociferous. You can read his writing, and I encourage you to. It's very engaging. And what I would point out here that characterizes his view is that he's written with co-authors that we are not fit for dealing with the future and its problems, with large-scale issues. He means war, climate change, world hunger, poverty. Those large-scale issues, he believes, we're not fit to deal with because we're too interested in our immediate kin. We're selfish. Our parochial morality is not fit to be empathetic to distant others. So he thinks we need moral enhancement to tackle these sorts of collective active action problems. He believes that we're headed for extinction if we don't enhance ourselves. And the enhancement is not just about morality, but also about living a good life in the first place. He believes that loads of people around the world are not necessarily living a life that is of value. So his primary strategy that he's quite well known for, I already mentioned a little bit, is negative genetic selection. He develops a principle that is a soft obligation. That is, it can compete with other obligations, like we have the liberty to procreate. So we can't have procreative beneficence trumping everything. But it's a soft obligation. He says, parents have a moral obligation when reproducing to select for the traits that will contribute to the best chances for the best life. So I call this a sort of technological imperative, and indeed he does too. The idea is whatever technology is available, we should use it to have the best children possible. And by best chances of the best life, Savulescu means the ability to enjoy life, to build a career, to have a family, all of those things that different theories of value would indicate are good. He talks about hedonistic theories of value. He talks about virtue ethics. welfarist versions of lives of value. He's quite thorough in trying to cover what counts as a good life. And he says not all children who are born have good chances at the best life. The best, indeed, among all the children you could have. Most children don't have that, and we should do something about that. So given existing technology, you would employ either selective abortion and prenatal diagnosis or in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So he definitely argues that terminating pregnancies is hard on people. He's a utilitarian, so that matters to him. So he wants us to think about doing pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and then using IVF to implant the selected embryo. In the future, whatever technology comes available, he wants us to use. For now, it's these two strategies. And I have a lot of responses here. Again, this is a person about whom I've written quite a bit. I'm concerned about what counts as like chances, what we can know about somebody's possible life through a genetic profile prior to birth. I'm worried about what we can know about the future and what traits will be good for the future. So I'm going to say a little bit about that. First, when Savulescu argues that we need enhancement in order to be better people, I see this as part of a long tradition of claiming that whether or not you're good or you're bad has something to do with your body. So he suggests the use of hormones to connect to distant others, the type of hormone that you gain from hugging someone close to you. He wants to have that in a nasal spray and have you take that in order to engage with distant others and then see them as somebody you care about. I don't know that I think it should be reduced to hormone, to the body. I think morality is complicated and interpersonal. I see this view that morality, whether or not you're good or you're bad, has something to do with your physical traits as being a continuation of what I call here enhancement thinking, but what you would also recognize as eugenic thinking. I also argue that Savulescu he's very clear that he's not a genetic determinist, but his view is pretty tied to genetic determinism. That is, he seems to believe that we can know enough from a genetic profile about a future child to know whether or not they have good chances at a good life. Quality of life, though, is, again, multifactorial. What's the world like that you're entering into? How will you be raised? With whom are you raised? What are our communities teaching in terms of values and things like that? And so I believe quality of life is social and political, not necessarily merely, as he seems to suggest, genetic and biological. That's not to say that the body doesn't matter. Indeed, it does. But I think he relies too heavily on genetics to talk about quality of life. Also, I say that procreative beneficence doesn't enhance anyone. So this is the trickiest part, and this I really struggle to share with folks, but I think it's important. Savulescu's strategy of negative genetic selection means that we're just picking who is going to be in the future. So none of those people who are born have additional capabilities or expanded capabilities. So on the transhumanist definition of enhancement, no one has been enhanced, but it still marks out sort of particular people as unworthy of life. So you get all of these bad impacts of making claims about people's futures, but none of the good of enhancing actually existing people. And actually existing disabled people are tightly linked now with risk or with vulnerability or with bad traits by Savulescu's discourse, by the way that he talks about disability. So no actually existing people are enhanced, but some actually existing people are at now a stigmatized or at a deficit on the basis of this view. So now that I've said something about the transhumanist views, and again, I'm happy to take questions about this. There's so much to say, and I want to engage in a good way with these views. Now that I've partially presented arguments from my book on these points, I want to sort of sum up a little bit about this view. I do think that across Bostrom and Savulescu's perspectives and other thinkers who are transhumanists or strong enhancement enthusiasts, there are assumptions that embodiment and disability are fundamentally risky and are barriers to happiness and justice. So these assumptions make transhumanist discourse alien to a critical disability perspective, because critical disability perspectives tend to focus on the body as the seat of meaning and interaction and as a source of joy and ability to experiment and live in a variety of ways. Critical disability perspectives also imagine disabled people to be involved in images of a better future. Whereas in Bostrom and Savulescu and other thinkers, the vision is a future with no disabled people. If disability is social and political, this isn't a very good view anyway, because the future is unknown. But regardless, if I want to be an ally to someone, I certainly don't want to express a view that makes it clear that I don't think those persons should in the future. So I'm going to go on now to briefly talk about how Foucault plays a role in my view. And I love entering Foucault into my slideshows. I usually have a slide where I just present his face and I say, now I'm going to use Foucault. I like his moral view, which boils down to, I think, 3 precepts. A lot of people don't think he has a moral perspective, but here's what I read from him. First, it's the right thing to do to refuse the status quo. Second, it's the right thing to do to get creative in your thinking. And third, it's the right thing to do to innovate. And all 3 of these things are actually really good things to use when thinking about technology. So I want to engage him a little bit on this transhumanist perspective to finally bring in the biopolitical. So Foucault talks about biopower as a governance strategy. So his view of power is that it suffuses our lives and enables our interactions, but also defines our interactions. Biopolitics or biopower is one type of power that happened in history and that's continuing to happen. And what biopower tries to do is to work on the level of the population and the level of the individual at the same time to secure the whole in face of danger. So often the internal dangers that are posed within a population are the abnormal individual who represents chance and risk, and because they throw off the ability for power, the status quo, the entrenched influencers to control and predict random future events and events that happen in a living mass. If you have an abnormal individual, you're not able to deal on the level of the average with the population. And Foucault notices this and talks about how this is dealt with. Specifically, biopower involves within it what Foucault refers to as a death drive. And the death drive within biopower recalls a much older form of power, what he calls sovereign power, which is the direct taking of life or the right of the sword. So the motto for this, and I'm pulling from one of his lecture series, if you want to live, the other must die. Now, I do believe that in the transhumanist thinking that was expressed, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that. Foucault writes that the biopolitical logic powers precepts. What power today believes is something like this. And this is a legacy from the 20th century, but continues today. Foucault writes, the more inferior species die out, the more abnormal individuals are eliminated, the fewer degenerates there will be in the species as a whole. And obviously, I don't share, he's critiquing this language, not using it. And the more I, as species rather than individual, can live, the stronger I will be, the more vigorous I will be able to proliferate. So biopolitical governance is the type of power that tries to calculate and manage risk. And transhumanists, I say, are doing that in their thinking about how to handle the future, how to live better, the threats that humanity faces, and what counts as quality of life. Transhumanists seem to want to quantify, evaluate, and mitigate the risk of disability, whether or not that's by transcending embodiment or by posing potential parents as risk managers on behalf of the whole population. Again, for Savulescu, no one in particular is being enhanced, but he's asking parents to choose children. And that means that those parents are deciding who will live. So again, I argue that transhumanism involves both positive and negative eugenics and follows biopolitical thinking. So Foucault's understanding of the biopolitical dictate, recall, is the more inferior species die out, the more I, as species rather than individual, can live, the stronger I will be, the more vigorous I will be. And again, that I as species level. So since we're discarding embodiment and selecting particular, what I'm going to call, after Leisha Carlson, another theorist, prenatal prototypes, this encouragement is connected then to biopolitical logic and involves both types of eugenics sort of united. Positive eugenics being the idea that we're trying to make ourselves better, and negative eugenics being the idea that we need to cull the population. And so the way that this gets combined for transhumanists is that by culling the population, we are better off, which I think is just classic sort of eugenics there. So I just want to mention, to sort of wrap up this portion, sort of my critical portion of my presentation. Sarah Ahmed is a philosopher, feminist, who for a long time was at Goldsmiths in the UK. She writes this in her book, Living a Feminist Life. There can be nothing more dangerous to a body than the social agreement that that body is dangerous. So I see this playing a role here because since transhumanists are marking out disabled people as a problem or the problem, that stigmatizes already existing disabled people and creates and directs risks toward them. So consider that it's difficult for disabled people to receive transplants. It's difficult for disabled people to receive prosthetics, as we saw in the in the presentation just before mine. It's difficult for disabled people to receive healthcare. Right now, it's quite difficult for disabled people to receive vaccines. The idea that disabled lives aren't worth living and can get in the way of a better future is a backdrop for differential treatment. And so transhumanists, so long as they buy in to this point of view, can't be said to be allies to disabled people. So what does it look like to push back? And this is where my positive view comes into play, where I have but suggestions of my own and a sort of counter discourse. So I've already said that I think that disability is politically and socially constructed. So what that means is that disability is contingent, dependent on other things, on other factors, and in a sense, unnatural. We build it. Of course, then it becomes part of our lives. So disability is not a neutral description of the body with a settled meaning. If all of that is true, that means that the way that we dream of the future and the way that we think about using technology impacts the materiality of disability and experiences of disability. So we should take up this site as a site of resistance, a significant space from which we can fight back to dream differently and to remake or reconsider what disability is. And I'm pulling there from Alison Kafer, whose work is incredible. Her book, Femme Queer Crip, which I strongly recommend. And Robert McGurr, another theorist, describes a version of this sort of resistance as a crip promise. And so I'm going to describe this reclaimed word crip promise in the following way, pulling from him. Quote, "We will always comprehend disability otherwise, and we will collectively somehow access other worlds and futures. So how can technology be a support to that?" I think we should understand enhancement as social and political. I've already made that very clear, rather than biological or personal. So let's use technology for social and political means. I have a suggestion about the Garage Museum in a minute with regard to that. We should take up responsibility for risk on the level of the collective. And again, these are parts of my crip promise about how to dream the future otherwise. Think about risk in relation to COVID-19. Doing things for each other, taking responsibility regardless of my supposed individual level of risk, which I don't really have an individual relationship to COVID. I have a collective relationship to COVID. We need to take up responsibility together in order to dream a different future. I also think, and this is where it gets really tricky, but I don't think there's such a thing as a life without risk, or even a life with significantly reduced risk. Even if you were somehow housed in a body of steel and metal, or other materials, titanium and things like that, and think about those prosthetics. Those break down, those rust, those need repairs. There's no such thing as a life without risk, but I don't think that's antithetical to living well. And so when we talk about enhancement, an enhancement of human life, I don't think it should be about eliminating risk. I also think that we have to be radically open and creative, pulling from Foucault, for an uncertain future. So consider climate change, consider other things about the future that we don't know. We don't actually know what is fit for the future, what traits will be of value. And if we're going to promote the use of technology to enhance the human body, we should be sure that we're humble about what we know and don't know about what's going to be good in the future. Different body shapes, different needs, different metabolisms, all kinds of things are open to consideration. So I want people to do social and political enhancement, try to make people better off, and planning futures that can include all of us. We need critical alliances among all kinds of different people who are marginalized to critique oppressive circumstances and call for change, often using technology, whether or not it's closed captions, or something like that. That's a technology, or the person's providing the interpretation here today, ASL, right? Anything else that would enhance accessibility. We're going to call for change and point back to political decision-making rather than inborn traits. That's another element of my counter discourse here. So this doesn't require us to reject technology. I am not always comfortable with Donna Haraway, but often very inspired by Donna Haraway, another theorist. And she says that what we need is a slightly perverse shift in perspective. Use technology to challenge domination rather than be dominated by it. We can use technology as a means of inclusion rather than a biopolitical tool. Think about wheelchairs, for example. We're not politically invested properly in assistive technologies. So this again calls back to previous presentations from today. Where's our investment, our political and social investment in making such technologies available? Prices are too high, and the quality of those devices outside of showrooms for new technology is pretty low. People need access, and that's social and political. And even though these devices are overpriced and unavailable, somehow reproductive technologies like maternal serum screening at 10 weeks is widely available, right? That's taken as a necessary investment. We need to shift that. So how might this look at the Garage Museum? I was thinking a lot about a presentation I saw a few years ago from a group of architects and bioethicists. And they looked at the example of a hospital that used virtual reality goggles. So in Ray Kurzweil's work, the guy that popularized the concept of the singularity. In Ray Kurzweil's work, he imagines that we would use virtual reality goggles to have intimate relations with people that we don't know, celebrities, maybe, things like that. So it would enhance sex lives, essentially, or allow us to have romantic encounters that the illusion would be so good that we wouldn't know the difference. So that's like an entertainment use, I'm gonna say. And most people do imagine virtual reality goggles to be used for entertainment. But what if virtual reality goggles are used by architects to simulate the experience of a physical space from diverse embodied points of view? So you might recreate a shortness of stature so that you could see what the space looks like from that positionality. You might recreate somebody with color blindness. You might recreate somebody who's sort of hard of hearing or has low vision, and experience that physical space from those embodied points of view, ultimately leading to inclusive changes. Maybe that would be interesting to do at the Garage Museum. So in conclusion, these two theorists that I really like, Raina Rapp and Faye Ginsburg, see the potential to create a habitable future. But to do that, we need to make disability count for the future. Use technology to make disability count, rather than counting disability in order to control the future. So I say, let's support enhancement strategies that emphasize collective responsibility, social and political change, and inclusive futures. And let's take up medicine and technology, including access and payment for these services on behalf of and directed by those persons whose projects and desires would be served by them. Disabled people, right? Let's listen and let people who are using the technology take the lead. So thank you so much to those who invited me today, Maria and Azel. Thank you to the Garage Museum for having me. And you can reach out to me at this email address or take a look at my website if you would like. And that is what I would like to, that is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Мелинда, спасибо вам.
Melinda, thank you so much. I hope you are getting simultaneous interpretation in Zoom. Are there any questions from the floor? Well, there are questions. We don't have any questions submitted to us through the YouTube chat box.
For your presentation, it was really interesting. And you've mentioned your book. Could you please tell the name of it? I'm sorry if I missed it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Absolutely. The book is called The Bioethics of Enhancement. It has a subtitle as well, but you can find it that way. The Bioethics of Enhancement, Transhumanism, Disability, and Biopolitics, published in 2016.
Спасибо, Мелинда. Есть ли еще вопросы?
Thank you, Melinda. Any other questions? We don't seem to have any other questions, and I don't see any questions in the YouTube chat box. In that case, Melinda, thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.
Have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of the conference.
I think I am
Заканчиваем мы
live
сегодняшний
already,
день
so we
лекцией
are
Екатерины
going
Никитиной,
to
которая
round
является
off today
исследовательницей
with
в
the
области
talk
Animal
presented
Studies, а
by
также участницей
Екатерина Никитина.
открытой
She's a
платформы
researcher in
Posthuman
Animal
Studies
Studies,
Lab.
and she is a
И мы
participant of the
поговорим
open
о
platform, which is called
теле и
Posthuman
технологиях,
Studies
о
Lab.
границах
We're
человеческого.
going to
В
talk
общем, мне
about
кажется,
the
это будет
body
очень
and
интересно,
technologies,
ровно так же, как
about
все предыдущие лекции. Хорошего вечера.
the boundaries of what it means to be human. Thank you very much, but let me launch my slides on the screen. What do I need to do here? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for still being here. When it comes to my talk, of course, I will try to be as brief as possible, but I do have this predilection to be rather long-winded. But my lecture is more academic rather than popular, therefore I really hope that we will still have some time left for the Q&A session so that we can discuss all of the postulates that I'm about to share. When I was getting ready for the lecture today, I decided to shift the focus. I was present in the audience today. I heard all of the talks about technology, cyborgs, and so on. But let me tell you straight away, in my talk, I will not talk about the cyborgs, but in my talk, I will talk about the vulnerability of the prosthetic. As parts of our discussion today, I would like to focus on a number of things that I'm interested in, a number of things that are part of my researcher's interest. First of all, I wanted to talk about the duality of the nature versus culture, and how do we take this duality and how do we extrapolate it on technology, because usually we view technology as something that separates nature from culture. So here I would like to talk about life as bios, as it was understood in ancient Greece, and we find the same root. The root is bio. When we talk about such things as biology, bionics, biotechnology, therefore life as bios. How is life as bios connected to instrument and technology? The root of the word is techne. It also comes from ancient Greek, but this root is only encountered a couple of times in ancient Greek. Homer, I think, had a bios as a bow, and Hercules also mentions it, but this link, this connection is very important for us because it can be used as a critique of the duality of life and technology. The next issue that I want to talk about is the issue of prosthetic and the human body. I would like to say that any human body originally is prosthetic. So I will talk about Stigler's philosophy, and I will give you a brief history of the issue. I would also like to talk about the vulnerability of body, the vulnerability of prosthetic, and I will talk about an American artist, Lisa Bufana, who is the amputee artist. I will also talk about the artwork by Sonora Taylor. She is also a disabled artist, and she explores such borderline subjects as human disability and animal disability. At the end, we will talk about healthcare. How do we talk about care? How do we talk about health? And how can we readdress this topic when we talk about prosthetics and the human body? When we ask ourselves what it is that distinguishes nature from human beings, I don't know why it's not working. Quite often we can hear the arguments about the intrinsic technological culture of humans. So we say that human culture is technological, and therefore it is in opposition to natural atechnological nature. Trying to find an answer to this question, I looked at different etymological dictionaries. Having studied different etymological dictionaries of ancient Greek, English, New Greek, and so on and so forth, I looked at very old dictionaries. But an interesting fact that I've noticed, I looked at the Greek-English lexicon based on the German work of Francois Passot. So this is a Greek-English dictionary that is based on the work of Francois Passot. In this dictionary, we can witness a very interesting transformation of three terms. Bios, which means life. Bios. It is a very interesting notion. I will not explain it right off the bat. And Zoe, or Zoe, Zoe is an ancient Greek word which denotes life, but life that is not conscious, life that we had before birth, and life that is going to continue after death. So how is this life connected to bias? How is it connected to the cultural life? And how is it all connected to the life that transforms this Zoe into a different form? Turns out that an important link here is the technique or the instrument that is used. This instrument or technique is bios, which is the most ancient word, and this word we can find in the works by Homer in the Iliad. So there is a short fragment in the Iliad in the work of Heraclitus. What does bios mean? Bios actually translates as a bow. So it is an ancient, a primitive technology, as this dictionary explains it to us. It's quite similar in spelling to bios, which means life. So why is bios and bios are so similar? This dictionary explains it to us that ancient people used bows to hunt, so therefore hunting provided the means of survival, it provided the means to life. What is also interesting here, it is also interesting to look at fragment number 48 from Heraclitus, and it says that the name of the bow is life, and so the business of the bow is to bring death. Therefore, these words are quite similar in spelling, but I believe that they form a tripartite alliance: bios, bios, and Zoe. I think that life in itself cannot be separated from technology, therefore natural cannot be separated from unnatural. So I believe that this is a tripartite alliance, and I do not think that we should divide between these three notions. I do not think that it is actually the right approach to practice this duality between nature and technology in our everyday life. We shouldn't talk about superhumans, cyborgs. We shouldn't focus on continuous self-enhancement. Another thing that I wanted to mention, you know that the previous lecture talked a lot about biopolitics, and I do have something to say on the subject. So when we talk about bios, bios, and Zoe, we can look at the work of an Italian researcher, Roberto Esposito. He wrote a book called Bios, Biopolitics, and Philosophy. And in this work, he said that this drive to conquer Zoe, to conquer unconscious life and to transform it into self-aware cultural life, basically this notion is the human desire of control, of governance and subordination. But the more we use the technological instrument to conquer life, the more we open up to Zoe, which is out of our control and therefore accepts many forms of resistance. So here, of course, we can mention a lot of catastrophes. There were many disasters in labs. Therefore, when this boundary between Zoe and bios is violated, it usually results in a disaster. Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher, laid out a concept of initial technology of human being. Therefore, he talks about human beings as beings who cannot exist without technological expansions of their body. So humans cannot exist without prosthetics, and he views prosthetics very broadly. A prosthetic is the sum of technological inventions that we use every day: our clothes, my glasses, our laptops, that some researchers view as a continuation of our memory. Therefore, these are the tools which expand any human body, and therefore they define the form of human body, and they define the mode of our existence. Our existence is never finalized, it's always ongoing. In his book Techniques and Time, and of course here he gives us a clear reference to Heidegger, being and time. So he defines the myth about Prometheus. So the myth about Prometheus is interpreted differently by different philosophers, but one thing that stands out for me, if you look at this myth describes the appearance of human beings, or how human beings came to be. So here we have two brothers, Protagoras and Prometheus, and of course this is a myth about Prometheus. So what happens? Zeus gives Epimetheus and Prometheus. Prometheus is a clairvoyant, and Epimetheus, of course, is his forgetful brother who is always looking back. So he gives them a task to distribute gifts to humans. So Epimetheus asks his brother Prometheus to give him a chance to do it independently. So what he does, he very carefully divides gifts between mortal beings. He gives some beings claws, some beings beaks. He gives some beings strong legs so they can run fast. So basically, he gives techniques to all living beings, but he forgets about humans. And that's where Prometheus gains a central role. He decides to steal the divine technology and to give it from gods to humans. That's why people are not born like animals, but originally people are born unfinished. People are wounded, people are forgotten. Therefore, people need help. People need a prosthetic in order to be born, in order to conquer death. So what becomes this prosthetic? Of course, it is technology. Therefore, Stigler views this ancient Greek myth negatively, and by negatively I do not mean badly, but he says that a human being is born, therefore the corporality, the embodiment of the human body is born out of an unfinished process. We do not have something that we can spare us from death. Therefore, technology brings us an extension that allows us to continue living. Therefore, when we're talking about post-humanist or transhumanist studies, there was an attempt to view this negativist view of the human origin through an affirmative lens. So we can view human bodily prosthetic or the unfinished nature of humans as an ethically important point. We can look at it not like we look at a closed wounds, but we can view it as something that allows us to improve on our existence, to enhance it, and to make our existence go on multiple planes. Therefore, Stigler talks about prosthetic nature of human body, which makes people open, unfinished, which makes them part of this constant process of becoming through human and inhuman acts. Therefore, originally, it is unclear where the human body is placed. There is not a single locus for the human body to exist. So this initial lack of territory becomes the primary characteristic of humans, and that's what makes humans vulnerable to something that is inhuman, i.e., technological or animalistic. Therefore, when we look at Stigler, we can say, like Sarah Kambler and Ioana Zielinska said, that the technological nature of humans can be interpreted as a special state of openness to the other. And by other, we mean other beings, non-human beings. We're open, our body is prosthetic-like, and that is something that gives us a special awareness of the other. And by other, we mean not just other people, but also viruses, animals, plants, machines, and therefore our body becomes a constantly changing assemblage. So here we are not so talking about the grade of technology of our body, but our body becomes multiple in and of itself. Therefore, technology becomes an agency between something that's human and something that's non-human. It becomes an agent in this divide where the hybrid being, such as human being, appears. Therefore, if we look at the cyborg as a hybrid between a human and a machine, and Donna Haraway wrote about it very ironically in the Cyborg Manifest when she said that we are already cyborgs. Look at the development of our medicine, look at the military industrial complex, look at how we make our food, and look what happens to our body in the context of biogenetic capitalism. What I'm trying to say that something that is human is unfinished, open, unclosed, chimeric. Something that is human shouldn't be viewed as a finished image. It embodies different, and it is marginal to the notion of human and non-human. Therefore, the human body that is vulnerable to the other is both conceptual and real substance of the work of Lisa Bufano. And Lisa Bufano herself is an artist with disability. So in her performative art, the issue of the body that is characterized by disability, by something that's unfinished, is viewed as part of the new materialist philosophy. Therefore, it brings a new meaning to this discourse of prosthetics. It readdresses prosthetics ethically, affirmatively. In the work of Lisa Bufano, a body with disability is related to the notion of a human body as an open wound. But Anne-Mylène Galland, a researcher in disability studies who wrote The Disabled Body in Contemporary Art book, she says that the source of all bodily metamorphosis comes down to open embodiment. So the body is viewed as an open wound. According to this ontological insight, according to the Stigler's philosophy, according to the Prometheus myth and to the origin of people and animals, the wound and the body are readdressed within the new materialist philosophy, within the feminist philosophy. They are viewed as an opportunity and not as a deficit.
And in this regard, a prosthetic is no longer a deficiency, it's a sign of excessiveness. And it's quite clear from what Bufano does, because she can wear different prosthetics for her performances. In other words, prosthetic limbs allow her to find additional opportunities that go beyond the bodies and within the body. She uses mechanical limbs both upper and lower limbs made of different materials, and that allows her to create chimeric-like creatures on the boundaries of human beings and non-human beings. And this is a result of integrating a human body with the prosthetics. And Bufano changes all the time in the course of her performances. She takes the shape of a spider, for instance, as is part of the mentally fine performance. The quality of the image is not good, but she tries to represent a plant of sort, because this is the root legs performance. At the previous slide, you would see an insect, or she could even take a shape of a fish or other polymorphic organisms. The polymorphic goes hand in hand with incompleteness notion of a human body, and naturally a female body plays an important role in her performances, as opposed to a male body. A female body is usually used to depict a monster, because it changes all the time. Internal processes are something that scare various philosophers, and I do believe that a female body plays a specific role in that. And I believe that Bufano creates a poetry of vulnerability. Stigler's school of thought believes that it's a deficiency, while in her case, she is an advocate of feminist school of thought. It becomes an opportunity. Another thing worth mentioning is that one of the relevant ideas is that poetry actually opens up the idea that a human body, a human life per se, is fragile. It changes all the time. It gets reformed and reassembled all the time. Much depends on the way we interact with the outside world. So if we take a closer look at what the philosophy has to say about that, and I hope it will give us a better idea how to properly interpret it. So the main idea that I would like to hone in on is the effectiveness, which starts with an A. So basically it refers to Spinoza's philosophy to say that an effect is a non-subject related intensity that is linked to the opposite forces going through the body that actually brings the body together, which means that a greater force of one body inevitably results in a destruction of another body. So the matter that we are made of, when it gets in contact with other types of matter, results in an eternal process of development. So the main conclusion is that a prosthetic body is vulnerable and so on and so forth, but this is the only way for anybody to exist. Therefore, I believe that these performances actually force us to revisit the ideas proposed by Stigler. A prosthetic body image, well, you should not take it literally, of course. A lack of something does not mean that a body is prosthetic. By a prosthetic body, we can actually mean any human body. I will give you more details on animals later on. Anyway, a human body could serve as a symbol for the existence of humankind and a symbol of all the changes. And I'm not saying that it's about about being afraid of death. We're talking about different ways of coexistence of different bodies. And now I'd like to refer another interesting author that you might have heard about, Heinrich von Kleist. Back in 1801, he wrote a very interesting text about the puppet theater, and let me quote what he had to say. It's about the unlucky unlucky puppets who had mechanical legs who were happier than any other ballet dancer for a very simple reason. Well, they don't have to pretend, and the main difference between a human and a puppet, or the difference between a person with a disability who uses prosthetics, is that people without disabilities tend to pretend, but when you come across something with effectiveness, that makes you more natural. And I believe that it's a very interesting idea that was for the first time stated by von Kleist. So let me quote his work. Have you heard about of those artificial legs made by English craftsmen for people who have been unfortunate enough to lose their own limbs? And well, to continue the quote, a master like that, a craftsman like that, who could make such remarkable limbs, could surely build a complete marionette or a puppet for him to his specifications. So it goes to show you that a puppet could be natural. How come a human is not natural without getting in contact with a non-human object? So it's an interesting quote. And to go back to the boundaries separating the mechanical things and the natural things. Another interesting idea that I want to share with you is that things, because of its infinite capacity to induce motion and to be motioned, that is, through effectivity, a body is never crippled or incapacitated. This is my interpretation of his quote. This is not a direct quote, but his main idea is that anybody incentivizes another body to move, and based on that, effectivity is a notion that means that no body is ever crippled or incapacitated. And Spinoza says that on a plane of immanence, there is no distinction between the artificial and the natural, as each actor, in other words, each stakeholder is characterized by movements and effects in which he or she participates, whether they be artificial or natural. And immanence is inclusion in the process of becoming and immersion in materiality. And we should experience, and by the way, I believe this is the main idea behind the Buffano's performances. So we should experience our own inclusion in a world in which we never start. We never create tabula rasa. We slip between, we enter the middle, we maintain or impose rhythms. In other words, going back to the Epimetheus and Prometheus myth, we never come into the world naked. We are always part of a process. We're part of a development process. We are part of interacting with other actors, creatures, technologies, you name it. We are never a blank page. We are always part of this development process, and we come into this world as an integral part of it. And when I look through the performances by Buffano, I realized that in this context it would be quite interesting for me to deep dive into the prosthetics for animals, and actually the entire disability issue in the animal world. Well, I guess Haroy would argue with us to say that there is no such thing as a division between the cultural and the natural, and given the global proliferance of humankind among on our planet, there are no natural style animals, because even wild animals have been mapped out. They interact with us either directly or indirectly, and that actually means that a disability issue in the animal world is an arguable point, just like the division between the natural and the cultural matters. For animals, it's not an issue, because if you believe that a disability is a social structure, then it does not exist for animals, though we can hardly state it on their behalf. And Bufano creates images of monsters and monstrous creatures. However, these images are always of a dual nature. If you watch the video of one of her performances, you will realize that sometimes you have no clear idea who it is that you see, a person with a disability or a spider with a prosthetic limb. And it seems to me that it's really important to understand the way this issue works with animals. Unlike people, animals don't span any myths. They get born, they get natural technologies to use, so there are no myths around animals. However, there are domestic animals, and it's a different can of worms. And Sonora Taylor would be a good example of a person studying the animal problem. Hold on a second, I don't seem to be able to advance my slides. Something is probably wrong with the clicker. Thank you for that. Right, so she tried to deep dive into her own disability. She suffered from ortho deficiency from birth, and she tried to compare her disability with similar disabilities in animals. And one of her worldwide famous statements in the disability studies community, of course, was stated in the Beast of Burden, which is the title of a book she authored. It's probably a beast bearing some burden, and we're all susceptible to this burden regardless of our nature. So the issue of domestic animals is quite interesting in this regard, because it turns out they do get prosthetics, and there are volunteers who offer prosthetics to domestic animals. So there are NPOs, non-profit organizations. By the way, there are lots of them out there in the West. And there are other people who try, like Taylor, who try to compare their own disabilities with those found in animals. So one of the questions is, how integral a part is disability? Does it serve as a common denominator for all of us? Trying to revisit the issue of vulnerability of prosthetics and disability of a prosthetic body becomes a source of revisiting and rethinking our approaches to dealing with other species. And basically, it also allows us to revisit the role of total difference inherent in other species. Like I said, there are no such myths around domestic animals. However, they are a good example of one of the first technologies for enhancing humans, because domestic animals are an enhancement for the human embodiment. This is the last but one slide in my presentation, and I'd like to demonstrate it to you before I move on to the takeaways. What I'd like to emphasize is that in the post-human paradigm, in the feminist paradigm, a vulnerability becomes part and parcel of the prosthetic body ethics, which is both human and non-human at the same time. And this human-focused ethics is what we have deep down inside us. This is the human nature, and this is the way our being has been structured. Our embodiment is always incomplete. And the modern feminist discourse is about the cyborg or the prosthetic body. It stands for the opposition between the open multitude and the closed individuality, and the monstrous ancient goddesses that are depicted in the performances and the various works of art, and the versus the holistic mother that gave birth to these creatures is what Stigler tried to interpret when he worked with various myths. The world is a huge, constantly changing eco-community, and the only way to survive in this world is to take part in the ever-eternal polymorphism of insects, cars, domestic animals that suffer from the man-produced technologies and forms. And in conclusion, I'd like to quote K. Barad. This is a chapter, the title is A Gentle Realism, Meeting the World Halfway is the name of the book, I believe, and basically it sums up everything I tried to drive the message home. So she says, the luxury of taking for granted the nature of the body interacting with a world that is shaped by an image of normal embodiment is possible due to the privileges of ableism. Only when the body ceases to function as it should, when it breaks down, such prerequisites come to the surface. We actually realize that we have a body. And it's often the case that the apparatus is first noticed when it fails. When such uncomforts arise, the entanglement of the phenomenon and the importance of the agental gap, along with the accompanying constructive exceptions, it then becomes clear that health is not a natural state of being, but a special form of embodiment that is jointly constituted by the delimiting practices that distinguish between healthy and people with disabilities. It just goes to show you that health is not something which is given. It's a privilege which is perceived by healthy people as opposed to people with disabilities. And being healthy means that you use other bodies, animals, species, technologies as prosthetics. You can expand the list with no limitations. So being healthy, being able-bodied means that you are in a prosthetic relationship with someone who has a disability. And I don't mean disability literally. I mean some sort of incompleteness of the prosthetic nature of any specific body. And biology proves this paradigm because we always interact with a multitude of other humans, non-humans, and so on and so forth. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, comments, or interventions.
Thank you very much. But, well, actually, I have a question, if you don't mind. My question is more to find out your opinion. What do you think this definition of multitude, of the openness, of the very nature of human, can this definition be used as an adequate argument in favor of the concept of diversity? Because diversity has become a trend in the Western world. What do you think? Thank you very much about your question. But I actually, in my talk, I chose to focus on more ancient texts that to show you that this problem is not new. It has been around for a long time, and it is not a trend. It is certainly not a trend. It is a fact of the Western European culture that is quite often ignored. That's why I don't really like talking about trends, and I do not like being a part of trends, whether they're transhumanistic trends, whether we need to upload our consciousness to a thumb drive, or whether we're talking about post-humanistic trends, talking about openness and multitudes. I think we should always find the golden mean. We should always look at something that's in between. Therefore, I do not have a ready answer for you. I can only ask questions. What I'm interested in the state of being human, and that always arises at this divide of being human and non-human. Being human means talking about all of these human terminals. Therefore, we exist marginally. We exist at the borderline of what it is to be human. It is an ethical question. Being human means being open to the other. When we are open to the other, we have this important ethical task of how do we communicate with the other. Therefore, some researchers want to expand on the ethics of the dialogue, this Vinasa dialogue. To tell you about it briefly, when you meet another person, and of course, Vanessa was writing about it in the context of the Second World War. But when you meet another person, the first thing that you experience is that you see the face of the other human. And the face of the other human tells you, do not kill me, let me live on. Therefore, as a human who enters a dialogue, and a dialogue is only possible, by the way, when you transcend self and when you are open to make the first step to the other. Therefore, it means that you are responsible for the existence of the other. So if you answered this non-verbal request to grant a life, if you met somebody face to face, therefore you are responsible for the other, because a dialogue can only be possible in this open state. So Levinas is writing about humans, but what if we expand this concept to animals, for instance? And by the way, I don't know how we can expand it to machines, because quite often we're talking about simulation, but still, how do we talk to humans? I can give you an example. How can a face-to-face dialogue be possible with a person who had a facial transplant or a person who has a prosthetic instead of a face? Does a person like this is a person like this undeserving of your responsibility if you initiate a dialogue? And the same is true about animals. When we meet animals, is it a face-to-face meeting? In the Slavic paradigm, in the Orthodox paradigm, animals do not have faces. They have a spiritual face. Therefore, we're talking about a certain responsibility. So I was very interested in exploring this ontological openness to the other. And I was very interested at looking into this ethical state. I mean, I cannot just, wave it aside. We can try, but I don't know how it can be done. Thank you very much. I have another question. When we read about the critique of openness and some multiplicity, some people who critique it, they say that there is a risk to end up in chaos, and the multiplicity means chaos. So what do we do in this case? Do we have any answers, or should we just normalize chaos, and would that give us a solution? Thank you very much. Yes, quite often multitude or multiplicity is viewed as a total openness. It is usually viewed as, well, I'm going to transform right now. I'm going to do whatever I please with my body. I'm going to change it in whatever way I came. I say want to take animal genes. I want to transplant animal genes into my genome. So when we view multiplicity as such, therefore we end up in the area of transhumanism, like Melinda talked about today. We can use our body as an avatar and we can change it every day. But multiplicity, I think, is not, and openness is about something different entirely. It's about maintaining a distance. It's about the other, and the other always calls for a certain distance. You cannot absorb the other. If you do that, you would rape the other. And what's very important here is that multiplicity is about the expansion or multiplication of borders. We do not get rid of the boundaries or the divide between people and animals, between technology and culture, but we take this duality and we separate it to increase the number of facets, to increase the number of boundaries. We are saying that this is how we're different, and this and this and that makes us different, and that's something that makes us similar. I think that's what multiplicity is all about. So there are lots of boundaries, a lot of borders, but what's important here is to maintain a distance. Without a distance, it will all be too holistic. Thank you very much, Ekaterina. Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to thank you, first of all. And I wanted to wait for the critique of what is normal. And of course, I understand this link between ability or disability and non-disability. But this situation, when something breaks, does it happen in the moment, or is break inherent to the body? Is it congenital? Is it acquired? And how can it be applied to neurologically different people who do not have, let's say, a physical prosthetic, but people who are different when compared to norm, in quotation marks? And then you mentioned care. You said that you're trying to bring everything to the issue of care. Well, you know, when you talked about breakage, that is a great point. When does this breakage occur? Is it original, or does it happen as part of a process? Well, you know, you've given me food for thought, and it is a very good question, because if we were to take Stigler's point of view, then the breakage is something that's original. But how important it is when the breakage happens? Is it important? And how important is it? I don't know how to say it, but I'm probably on the same plane of immanence that Deleuze talked about. Theoretically, it seems to work, but then again, consciousness defines actions, so I do not see a gap here. But I'm not sure how to answer your question, whether it is significant or not, whether it is important or not. It is a very good question, but this question needs an answer for sure. But I wouldn't like to bring this question to the issue of people with disability. I have a message, no, not a message. I don't want to send any messages. I have an intention, or maybe a theoretical way to approach it. I think that, do we actually need this notion? in this reality, at this stage, we seem to need it. But if we're talking about the ethics of relations, then the notion of disability disappears. By the way, Sonora Taylor wrote a whole book on the subject, and the position laid out in the book is clear that this notion doesn't really help us. It hinders us. And she was writing it as a person with disability. Therefore, a lot of answers are possible to this question, even very personal answers. And when it comes to care, care is part of the concept of vulnerability. Vulnerability when it comes to the other, the openness of the body, the vulnerability of the body, the openness of a human being towards the other. Therefore, it entails responsibility. Responsibility means care, and care doesn't mean to forcefully offer help. It is all about maintaining a distance. By the way, I would like to recommend a book written by Belacasa, and it is a book on new bioethics. So in this book, the author writes a lot about care, and the author says that care is a political choice. You do not have to help anyone, and the state of another human being doesn't mean that you have to be part of this care-giving or receiving relationship. It is a political choice, and sometimes it is better not to help, and that is quite okay. Care is about choice. Care is not about moral obligations. How do I put it? Care is not about moral force. So care is not a duty. It is a choice. Therefore, the concept of vulnerability shines an interesting light on this matter. Of course, when it comes to the body, care is not only about involvement, but also about uninvolvement. When your immune system takes care of you, it creates a dialogue with the environment. Therefore, if we view care in the context of dialogue and political choice, that would be an interesting angle. Thank you very much. I'm getting very interesting feedback and very interesting questions, and I think I should readdress this topic. I've been concentrated on animal studies, and when we're talking about animals, we're not talking about these breakages or failures. It seems as if animals are not aware of what's happened to them, and I think Taylor also points to this. When we're talking about breakage or failure, it can happen during a life, but it doesn't mean that failure means suffering. Failure is not equated to suffering. She actually gives an interesting story. A fox with arthrogryposis was killed by a forester because the forester wanted to save a fox, but a human being with the same diagnosis can lead a happy life. So it is not about suffering. Therefore, we shouldn't equate care, or we shouldn't mix care and suffering. I would like to add my 2 cents. Let's talk about the needs to use the notion of disability. I think what's important is to give for people a choice to define themselves. People can define themselves as a person with disability, a person without disability. People should define themselves as, I don't know, wives, spouses, and so on. This, again, is the issue of personal boundaries. And if we were to imagine an unrealistic utopian situation when disability disappears, when disability carries no more meaning, when everybody can fulfill their desires, have their needs met, and so on, we still should live a chance for self-determination. We shouldn't take this possibility of self-determination away from people. Therefore, we should never say that a disability will disappear. It might happen like this, but again, we shouldn't ban anybody from defining themselves as a disabled or non-disabled. Maybe it is provocative, maybe it merits critique. No, actually it doesn't. I agree with you. What's very important here, what's very important in this whole discussion is, of course, a personal point of view. Therefore, I support you. With this, let's wrap up day one of our conference. We will see you here tomorrow and online. We will see you online on the 3rd of April. I think we had a very interesting discussion, and thank you very much for being with us today.